Across this series, we've walked through places that leave behind quiet questions. An entire city built underground, a stone road cut into rock that runs straight into the sea, a small pyramid with nothing buried inside it, and massive stone boxes sealed so tightly they still challenge modern tools. Each place gives us just enough information to understand part of the story, and just enough missing pieces to keep us curious. We're not chasing theories here, we're simply standing in front of what still exists, and letting the questions remain where the answers end. This is a journey through real locations, real stone, and the calm mysteries that history never fully closed. The giant stone sphinx of Hadda, Afghanistan. In the plains east of modern Jalalabad, where dry earth stretches toward distant hills and the Kabul River cuts its way through the land, lies an area once filled with life, color, and movement. Today it appears quiet, scattered with low mounds and broken stone. But 2,000 years ago, this place known as Hadda stood among the most important Buddhist centers of the ancient world. Dozens of monasteries, stupas, and shrines once filled this landscape. Monks walked these paths. Pilgrims traveled through. Traders passed nearby on routes that connected India, Central Asia, and the Mediterranean. Among the countless sculptures and reliefs uncovered here, one of the most unusual is a giant stone sphinx, a figure rarely associated with Buddhism, and even more rarely found in Afghanistan. The existence of this statue raises quiet but persistent questions about artistic influence, cultural exchange, and how far certain symbols traveled across the ancient world. When archaeologists first documented the Sphinx fragments at Hadda in the early 20th century, the discovery stood out immediately. Here was a creature with the body of a lion and the upper form shaped in a human-like way, carved not in the style usually associated with South Asian religious art, but with features that traced back to the Mediterranean world. The statue was not small. It was part of a large sculptural program, meant to stand at human scale, or larger, positioned where anyone entering a sacred compound would see it. To understand why such a figure existed here, it helps to understand what Hadda truly was. During the first centuries BCE and CE, this region was part of the cultural zone historians call Gandhara, an area where Greek, Persian, Indian, and Central Asian traditions merged into a single artistic environment. This blending did not happen peacefully all at once. It unfolded over centuries through trade, conquest, settlement, and religious exchange. After Alexander's invasion and the rise of Greco-Bactrian, Indo-Greek kingdoms, Greek artistic traditions remained active here long after Greek political power faded. Buddhism arrived in this environment and adapted to it. The result was Gandharan Buddhist art stone sculptures of the Buddha and Bodhisattvas carved with realistic anatomy, flowing robes, detailed hair, and facial features influenced by Greek sculpture. Hadda became one of the richest centers of this art form. Thousands of statues once filled its monasteries. The Sphinx belongs to this moment of fusion. It would not have stood alone. It likely flanked an entrance, guarded a pathway, or framed a sacred courtyard. In many ancient traditions, animal guardians marked thresholds between the ordinary world and the sacred. In Egypt, the Sphinx guarded temples. In Greece and the Near East, lions and hybrid creatures served similar roles. What makes the Hadda Sphinx unusual is not only its form, but its placement in a Buddhist religious setting. Walking across the Hadda ruins today, there is little left standing upright. Looting, war, and centuries of erosion reduced most structures to foundations. The monasteries that once rose in painted plaster and brick now appear as low outlines in the earth. But when excavators worked here in the past, they uncovered thick layers of sculptural debris, fallen Buddhas, broken stupas, bodhisattvas, relief panels, and animal figures. The Sphinx fragments were found among this material. The condition of the statue suggests it once formed part of a fully integrated architectural composition. The lion body was carved with muscular detail. The chest was broad. The head carried stylized features that did not match local Indian traditions. The face was not fierce. Like much of Gandharan art, it carried a calm, composed expression. This alone suggests its role was not simply defensive or threatening, but symbolic. Archaeologists believe the Sphinx was positioned as a guardian figure, not in opposition to Buddhist ideas, but integrated into them. In Gandhara, familiar protective motifs were reinterpreted through a Buddhist lens. Guardians became protectors of the Dharma. Threshold figures became symbols of spiritual transition. Standing where the Sphinx once stood, You would have faced a visual language understood across different cultures. A Greek traveler would recognize the form. A local pilgrim would interpret the meaning through Buddhist symbolism. This overlap is what makes Hada so important. It was not a frontier between worlds. It was a place where worlds blended quietly. The size of the Sphinx is another important detail. This was not a decorative table sculpture. The scale tells us it was meant to be encountered physically, at eye level or higher. People would have passed by it during daily ritual movement. Its presence would have been constant, shaping how visitors experienced the sacred space. Unlike later monumental guardians carved into cliffs, the Hada Sphinx was likely made from stone blocks assembled with surrounding architectural elements. Gandharan builders frequently used stone combined with stucco to achieve detailed modeling. The Sphinx may have originally been finished in painted plaster, giving it vibrant color and surface detail. Today, only the stone core survives. The destruction of Hada was gradual, but relentless. By late antiquity, Buddhist activity in the region declined as new religious and political systems took root. Over centuries, the monasteries fell into ruin. Sculptures were buried by dust and debris. Earthquakes and floods took their toll. In modern times, many remaining artworks were damaged or stolen during decades of conflict. Yet, even in fragments, the Sphinx still carries its quiet challenge to simple historical narratives. It shows that symbols did not stay confined within the borders we draw on modern maps. A creature born in the myth world of the Eastern Mediterranean ended up standing in a Buddhist sanctuary in Afghanistan, reinterpreted through a different spiritual system. Walking through the site today, you see scattered stone faces emerging from the ground. Some are Buddhas with closed eyes, others are attendants. A few are animals. Each fragment is separate now, but once they formed a continuous visual environment, the Sphinx was one voice in that environment, not dominant, not central, but unmistakably present. Hada itself once included over 30 separate monastic complexes, spread across the plain. Each held stupas, meditation cells, courtyards, and teaching halls. The total number of statues originally here likely reached into the thousands. This was not a small provincial site. It was one of the artistic capitals of the Buddhist world. The presence of a Sphinx here reflects the sophistication of the community that sustained it. The materials used in the sculpture reveal careful planning. The stone is local, quarried from nearby hills. The carving shows efficiency rather than excess detail. The builders understood the durability required for an outdoor, guardian figure. The head was shaped to project authority without aggression. The lion's body conveyed stability more than motion. In ancient Buddhist architecture, entrances mattered deeply. The threshold between the outside and interior symbolized movement from distraction to awakening, from worldly noise to inner discipline. Guardian figures reinforced this transition. The Hada Sphinx likely stood at such a boundary, silently marking the shift. Modern visitors often struggle to picture Hada as it once was. The ruins feel empty today, but the archaeological record shows layers of ash, pottery, painted plaster, coins, and sculpture fragments. These layers tell the story of centuries of ritual life. The Sphinx stood through many of those centuries, witnessing monks chant, pilgrims arrive, rituals unfold, and ultimately, the slow fading of the tradition that built it. Its survival into archaeological memory is accidental. If it had remained fully intact on the surface, it may have been erased entirely by conflict or weather. Instead, its broken pieces were buried and rediscovered later, allowing it to remain part of the record. The giant stone Sphinx of Hada does not answer many questions directly. It does not carry an inscription telling us its name. It does not explain why this form was chosen. It does not proclaim a ruler's authority. Instead, it quietly demonstrates something more subtle, that the ancient world was far more connected than it appears. When history is taught in straight lines, a hybrid creature carved in a hybrid land, standing in a hybrid spiritual space. Hada itself now lies mostly silent. The monasteries are gone. The pilgrims no longer pass. The chants no longer echo across the plain. But the memory of what stood here remains through the fragments recovered and preserved in museums and archives. Among them, the Sphinx continues to stand out, not as a monument of power, but as a symbol of how ideas move, merge, and endure in stone. This is why the giant stone Sphinx of Hada belongs at the beginning of this series. Not because it is the largest or most famous, but because it reveals the central truth behind all the places we will explore. Ancient civilizations did not exist in isolation. They observed, borrowed, adapted, and reshaped the world around them, leaving behind forms that still challenge how we understand the past. The colossal stone Buddhas of Yungang, China. In northern China, where dry plains stretch toward distant mountains and the wind carries fine dust across the land, a line of sandstone cliffs rises quietly along the valley, outside the modern city of Datong. From a distance, these cliffs look ordinary, shaped by time and weather like countless others across the region, but carved directly into their face is one of the largest and most concentrated displays of monumental religious sculpture ever created by human hands. This site is known as Yungang Grottos, and within its rock walls stand 163 cave temples filled with more than 50,000 statues, including some of the tallest stone Buddhas in the world. When you first approach the cliff face, the scale is difficult to process. The openings to the caves appear like dark windows cut into the stone. Some are small, others are massive, rising like cathedral entrances carved directly into the earth. Stepping closer, the surface reveals layer upon layer of sculpted figures, Buddhas seated in meditation, standing attendants, guardian deities, celestial musicians, and intricate reliefs that cover entire walls, from floor to ceiling. Inside the largest caves, the Buddhas rise to heights of 15 to 17 meters, roughly the height of a 5-story building. You stand at their feet and look upward at faces that seem calm and distant, carved with symmetrical features and closed eyes. The sheer effort required to remove this much stone with ancient tools alone places Yungang among the greatest engineering achievements of the ancient world. To understand how these statues came into existence, we have to move back in time to the 5th century CE, during the rule of the Northern Wei. This dynasty was founded by the Tuoba people, a nomadic group from the northern frontier who gradually adopted many elements of Chinese culture, including Buddhism. When they made Datong their capital, they began transforming the region into a political and spiritual center. For the Northern Wei rulers, Buddhism was not just a personal belief, it was a state project. Large-scale religious construction helped unify populations of different backgrounds, provided moral legitimacy to the ruling elite, and linked the dynasty to the wider Buddhist world spreading across Central Asia, India, and China. Yungang became the physical expression of that ambition. The carving of the caves began around the year 460 CE. Teams of quarrymen, sculptors, engineers, and laborers gathered at the cliff. Unlike freestanding statues, these Buddhas were carved directly from the living rock. There was no possibility of moving or correcting them after completion. Every cut had to be planned in advance. The process began with removing large volumes of stone to hollow out the caves. Only after the rough chambers were formed did the artists begin refining the figures inside. Standing inside one of the main caves today, you can still see how the process unfolded. The back wall contains the primary Buddha figure. The side walls carry rows of smaller figures. The ceiling is carved with patterns that once held painted decoration. This layout was repeated again and again with variations. Some caves focus on a single, colossal Buddha. Others contain hundreds of small figures carved tightly together, representing infinite manifestations of the enlightened state. The earliest Yungang Buddhas reflect strong Central Asian and Gandharan artistic influence. Their faces are long, with deep-set eyes and sharply defined noses. Their robes fall in straight, heavy folds. These features trace back to artistic traditions that traveled along the Silk Road from regions now part of Afghanistan and Pakistan. Over time, as Chinese craftsmen took a greater role, the style shifted. Later figures at Yungang have rounder faces, softer expressions, and flowing robes that mark the beginning of a distinctly Chinese Buddhist aesthetic. Walking from one cave to the next is like moving through different phases of artistic history carved into stone. You can literally watch the evolution of Buddhist art unfold along the cliff face. Each cave represents not just a religious space, but a moment in cultural transition. The largest Buddhas dominate their chambers. Their heads nearly touch the ceilings. Their feet rest on elaborately carved lotus bases. The proportions are carefully balanced, so the body appears stable, despite its height. When you stand beneath one of these figures, the room feels compressed by its presence. The statue occupies almost all available space, leaving narrow pathways around it. This was intentional. The design forces the visitor into a physical relationship with the image, making the experience immersive rather than distant. The faces of the Buddhas at Yungang are striking for their calm. The eyes are half closed, the lips are gently curved. The expression does not announce power in the way imperial statues often do. Instead, it communicates stillness. This was not accidental. The sculptors aimed to create figures that embodied the Buddhist ideal of inner peace, offering a visual contrast to the harsh realities of frontier life during the early Northern Wei period. The number of figures at Yungang is overwhelming. In addition to the giant Buddhas, tens of thousands of smaller statues fill niches, columns, and walls. Some are only a few centimeters tall. Others reach 2 or 3 meters. Many represent bodhisattvas, beings who delay their own enlightenment to help others. Others depict donors, protective deities, and symbolic creatures. Together, they form a crowded visual universe carved into stone. The construction of Yungang was not purely religious, it was also political. By sponsoring massive Buddhist monuments, the Northern Wei rulers displayed their power through devotion rather than conquest alone. The caves became a statement that the dynasty was linked to cosmic order and spiritual legitimacy. In this sense, the stone Buddhas functioned as both religious symbols and instruments of state authority. The logistics behind carving Yungang remain difficult to fully grasp. The amount of labor required was enormous. Thousands of workers would have been needed over several decades. Stone debris had to be removed continuously. Tools had to be sharpened and replaced. Food, shelter, and water had to be supplied to the workforce. All of this indicates that the caves were not the result of small monastic communities but of centralized state planning. Despite their monumental size, many of the Yungang statues once carried fine surface detail that is now missing. The figures were originally painted in vivid colors: reds, blues, golds, and whites. Traces of pigment still cling to protected areas inside some caves. When fully painted, these interiors would have been intensely visual spaces filled with color, light from oil lamps, and the movement of shadows across sculpted surfaces. The environment that preserved Yungang for more than 1,500 years is also the one that now threatens it. Wind erosion, temperature fluctuations, and air pollution from modern industry have worn down the sandstone. Cracks spread slowly across surfaces. Fine details soften year by year. Conservation efforts are now focused on stabilizing the cliffs and reducing further damage. Walking along the line of caves, you notice how the cliff face is not uniform. Some sections are deeply recessed, others protrude outward. The ancient builders adapted each cave to the natural shape of the rock. This allowed them to select locations where the stone was strongest for the largest sculptures. Even with modern engineering, carving a stable 17-meter tall figure directly from a cliff without collapse would be an extraordinary challenge. One of the most famous Buddhas at Yungang sits in Cave 20. This figure was left exposed when the front wall collapsed centuries ago. Today, the massive Buddha faces the open sky. Its head rises against the backdrop of clouds and wind. This exposure allows visitors to see the full scale of the statue from outside, offering one of the most dramatic views at the site. Inside the darker caves, the colossal Buddhas take on a different presence. Light is limited. The figures emerge slowly from shadow as your eyes adjust. The silence is heavy. The walls feel close. The experience becomes less about observing sculpture and more about being inside a carved space shaped around a single dominating form. The religious purpose of these caves was not limited to display. Monks used them for meditation, ritual, recitation, and teaching. Pilgrims traveled from distant regions to visit the site. Offerings were left. Lamps were lit. The caves served as spiritual centers during a time when Buddhism was reshaping Chinese society. As centuries passed, the political center shifted away from Datong. The northern Wei court moved south. Eventually, Yungang lost its status as a state-sponsored project. The caves entered a quieter phase of existence. Monastic activity continued in smaller form. Later dynasties repaired some damage, added inscriptions, and maintained access. But the era of colossal carving had ended. Despite this, Yungang never vanished from memory. Travelers continued to record it. Local communities preserved its presence. Even after periods of neglect, the scale of the caves ensured they were never fully forgotten. In the modern era, systematic archaeological study revealed again just how significant the site truly is. Today, Visitors from around the world walk the same ground as ancient monks and workers. They stand beneath Buddhas, carved when Rome still ruled the Mediterranean, and the Gupta Empire shaped India. The distance in time is vast, yet the physical presence remains immediate. What makes the colossal stone Buddhas of Yungang especially powerful is not only their size, but their context. They were not created as isolated monuments. They are part of a continuous wall of sacred space extending more than a kilometer along the cliff. The entire landscape becomes a single architectural statement carved from the earth itself. Yungang shows how early Chinese Buddhism moved beyond wooden temples into permanent stone. It marks the moment when spiritual ideas became geological in scale. The cliff became a scripture, the statues became sermons carved into rock, the labor of thousands became devotion made visible. Even now, after 15 centuries of erosion, political change, and cultural transformation, the Buddhas of Yungang remain seated in meditation. Their expressions remain calm, their scale remains overwhelming. They continue to confront every visitor with the same quiet realization that ancient societies, armed only with stone tools, planning, and belief, were capable of shaping the earth itself into something that still challenges modern imagination. The hidden rock city of Uplasikhe, Georgia, on the banks of the Kura River, where dry hills rise from the valley and the land opens into wide horizons, there is a stone city carved directly into the rock itself. From a distance, it looks like a natural cliff face shaped by wind and erosion. But, as you move closer, doorways begin to appear, then chambers, then streets cut into solid stone. This is Uplasikhe, one of the oldest rock-cut cities in the world, built not on the land but inside it. The name Uplasikhe roughly means Fortress of the Lord. The site began as a small sacred settlement around the first millennium BCE and grew over time into a fully developed urban center. Unlike cities built with bricks and walls, Uplasikhe was shaped by removal rather than construction. Every room, every tunnel, every temple, every passageway was carved out of living rock by human hands. Walking toward the city today, the slope rises gently. At first, nothing feels unusual. The rock face is pale and weathered, but then the carvings begin to appear arch-shaped entrances, alcoves, stairways rising from nowhere. The hillside reveals itself as architecture disguised as geology. Stepping inside the first chambers, the temperature drops slightly. The sound of the wind fades. The walls are smooth in some places, rough in others. Tool marks still run across many surfaces, shallow lines showing where stone was chipped away section by section. This is not a ruin in the usual sense. It is a negative city defined by what was removed rather than what was built. At its height, Uplasikhe was not a village or an outpost. It was a major political, religious, and commercial center of the ancient Georgian world. Archaeologists estimate that thousands of people lived here at different times. The city contained royal halls, temples, living quarters, storage chambers, wine presses, drainage systems, and defensive tunnels, all carved directly into stone. The layout of the site shows careful urban planning. Main passageways connect smaller chambers. Open courtyards allow light to enter the deeper parts of the city. Some rooms are small and intimate, clearly used as living spaces. Others are large ceremonial halls with high ceilings and wide floors, designed to hold gatherings. One of the most important features of Uplasikhe is its religious core. Long before Christianity reached Georgia, this city served as a major pagan ritual center. Temples dedicated to sun worship, fire rituals, and local deities were carved into the rock. Altars were shaped directly from stone. Channels were cut into the floors to carry liquids used in ceremonies, likely water, wine, or animal sacrifices. One of the largest ritual chambers contains a raised stone platform at its center. The floor slopes gently toward carved grooves. This suggests ceremonial pouring rituals, where liquid offerings flowed along predefined paths, even without written records explaining the exact rites. The physical layout makes their purpose understandable. Above these ritual areas, carved staircases lead upward to vantage points overlooking the valley. From these heights, priests and guards could observe both the city below and the surrounding countryside. Uplasikhe was not only a spiritual center, but also a strategic stronghold controlling trade along the Kura River corridor. The Kura Valley was one of the most important trade routes connecting the Caucasus with Central Asia, Persia, and Anatolia. Merchants passed through this corridor carrying metal, textiles, food, pottery, and luxury goods. Uplistike benefited directly from this movement. Storage chambers cut deep into the rock were used to hold grain, wine, and supplies for both trade and survival during sieges. One of the most impressive functional elements of the city is its ancient winemaking system. Dozens of stone wine presses are carved into the rock. Large basins were used to crush grapes. Channels carried the juice into deep underground storage vessels, carved directly into bedrock. This shows that wine was not a minor product here, it was central to the city's economy and ritual life. As you move deeper into the complex, narrow tunnels appear, some barely wide enough for one person. These were part of the defensive system. During invasions, residents could move secretly between different sectors of the city without being seen. One major escape, tunnel descends sharply toward the river, allowing people to flee or access water during a siege. The defensive nature of Uplistike becomes even clearer when you reach its upper levels. The highest point of the rock city once held a fortress and lookout stations. From here, guards could see far across the valley. Any approaching enemy would be visible long before reaching the city. In the early centuries CE, Georgia gradually adopted Christianity. This religious shift transformed Uplistike. Pagan temples were abandoned. A Christian basilica was later built on top of the rock city, not inside it. This symbolic placement reflected the cultural change, the new faith physically rising above the old sacred center. This decision to build a church above the original city also had unintended consequences. The weight of the basilica destabilized parts of the rock below. Over time, cracks widened. Sections of the carved city collapsed. Earthquakes accelerated this damage. The same stone that had protected the city for centuries began to fail under the new load. Walking through Uplistike today, you can see where these collapses occurred. Entire halls are now open to the sky. Broken floors reveal chambers beneath them. What was once enclosed and protected is now exposed and eroded. Yet even in this damaged state, the complexity of the city remains clear. The residential sections show how everyday life unfolded here. Small rooms with benches carved along the walls served as sleeping areas. Niches created natural shelving for tools and lamps. Fire-blackened ceilings show where smoke once gathered from hearths used for cooking and warmth. Water management was crucial to survival in a stone city. Rainwater channels were carved across rooftops and along passageways. Water was directed into cisterns cut deep into the rock. These underground reservoirs stored enough water to support the population during dry seasons and during attacks. The sound inside Uplistike is unlike most ruins. Wind moves through tunnels and chambers, creating slow echoes. Footsteps sound heavier on stone floors. The environment feels enclosed, even when under open sky. This acoustic character likely played a role in ritual practices, where sound and chanting would have echoed through temples. Over centuries, Uplistike faced invasions by Persians, Arabs, Mongols, and regional armies. Each conflict reduced its population and destroyed parts of the city. By the late Middle Ages, its political importance faded. People relocated to newer settlements. The rock city was gradually abandoned. Nature then began to reclaim it. Soil-filled chambers, vegetation rooted in cracks, rainwater eroded, softened stone. What had taken centuries to build slowly returned toward a natural state. Modern excavation began in the 20th century. Archaeologists removed layers of debris and rediscovered the full scale of the city beneath. What emerged was not just a ruin, but a complete urban system preserved inside stone temples, streets, storage rooms, defenses, and living spaces, all connected without traditional construction materials. Standing at the central plaza of Uplistike today, you can look outward and see the full logic of the city's design. Streets radiate from the ritual areas. Defensive zones occupy the upper edges. Storage and production spaces sit deeper inside. Residential areas fill the spaces between. This was not a chaotic settlement. It was carefully organized. The age of Uplistike adds another layer of significance. Parts of the site were already ancient when Rome ruled the Mediterranean. Its earliest chambers may predate many classical civilizations. The fact that such a large, functional city was carved entirely from stone with no mortar, no bricks, and no visible external walls still challenges modern assumptions about ancient construction. Unlike cliff tombs or small cave dwellings, Uplistike represents permanent urban life carved into bedrock. It was not temporary shelter. It was a long-term commitment to stone as a living environment. As the sun sets over the Kura Valley, the rock surfaces glow softly. Shadows deepen across entrances and stairways. What looked like a hillside in daylight becomes a layered city of dark openings and rising terraces. The silence grows heavier. You begin to sense the weight of time here more strongly than in many built ruins. Uplistsikhe does not impress with height or monumental towers. Its power comes from invisibility, a city hidden in plain sight, a civilization that chose to live inside the earth rather than upon it. The hidden rock city of Uplistsikhe stands as proof that ancient people did not always express complexity through towering walls or great pyramids. Sometimes they chose to carve their world inward, shaping daily life directly out of the bones of the land. This city remains not as a myth or a legend, but as a physical place where streets, temples, homes, and tunnels still exist exactly where people left them waiting quietly. Inside stone, the giant Buddha head of Bamiyan, Afghanistan. In the high valleys of central Afghanistan, where wide plains open between rugged mountain ranges and the air feels thin and dry, there is a cliff face that once held two of the largest standing Buddha statues ever carved by human hands. This place is Bamiyan. For more than 1,000 years, the Bamiyan Buddhas looked out across the Silk Road, watching traders, monks, pilgrims, and empires pass through the valley below. Today, the statues are gone, but their absence has revealed something unexpected. Fragments, chambers, and giant stone remain still buried inside the cliff. Standing in the valley today, the first thing you notice is the emptiness. Two enormous vertical niches cut into the sandstone dominate the cliff face. These hollows once held the 55-meter and 38-meter Buddhas, carved directly from the living rock. Without the statues, the niches look like open wounds in the cliff. They give a powerful sense of scale, reminding you how vast the original figures truly were. The larger of the two Buddhas once stood taller than a modern high-rise building. Its head alone was several meters high. The surface of the statue was once covered in painted plaster, detailed with colors and patterns. The body beneath the paint was carved from sandstone, while wooden supports and clay modeling were used to refine the final shape. What remains now are scattered fragments of that structure, some still lodged deep within the niches and tunnels behind them. Bamiyan was not an isolated mountain outpost. For centuries, it was a major stop along the Silk Road networks, linking India, Central Asia, and China to the Middle East and the Mediterranean world. Buddhism spread through this region along these trade routes, and Bamiyan became a thriving religious center filled with monasteries, cave shrines, and teaching halls carved into the valley walls. The Buddhas themselves were created around the 6th century CE, during a period when Buddhist art in this region blended Indian spiritual tradition with Central Asian and Iranian artistic styles. Their faces were calm, their postures upright, their proportions carefully balanced to match the height of the cliff itself. Rather than standing in front of the rock, they were part of it. The mountain became the body of the Buddha. Behind and around the statues was an entire hidden world. Hundreds of cave chambers were carved into the cliff face. These caves served as meditation cells, chapels, storage spaces, and living quarters for monks. Some were small and narrow, others were wide and tall enough to hold gatherings. Their walls were once painted with detailed murals showing Buddhas, bodhisattvas, donors, and celestial figures. Today, many of these paintings are faded or damaged, but their outlines are still visible in protected areas. The construction of the Buddhas was a massive engineering effort. Workers carved tunnels behind the statues to access different sections during construction. Scaffolding made from wood was built up the cliff face. Stone was removed in stages, starting from the top and working downward. Once the rough form was complete, layers of clay and plaster were applied to refine the details. Finally, the statues were painted. These were not simple stone carvings. They were mixed media monuments built directly into the landscape using a combination of geology, carpentry, and sculpture. Their creation would have required planning across decades and the coordinated labor of large teams of skilled workers. For more than 1,000 years, the Buddhas remained standing. Earthquakes shook the region. Empires rose and fell. Islamic rule replaced Buddhist administration. Yet the figures survived. Even after Buddhism faded from the valley, they stood as silent witnesses to change, no longer worshipped as religious icons but still respected as ancient monuments of human history. The destruction in 2001 changed that permanence completely. The statues were deliberately demolished after weeks of repeated blasting. What remained afterward were not clean empty spaces, but shattered stone, dust, collapsed internal scaffolding, and partially exposed inner chambers that had never been visible before. In the years following the destruction, archaeologists began careful surveys of the debris. As they worked through the broken layers, they made an important realization. Much of the internal structure of the statues had not been completely destroyed. Portions of the heads, facial fragments, inner cores, and backing tunnels survived in buried form within the cliff and at the base of the niches. This is where the idea of the giant buried head comes from. The head of the larger Buddha was never a single solid piece. It was built up with layered materials over a carved stone base. When the statue was destroyed, heavy portions fell inside the niche instead of outward into the valley. Some of these core sections remain buried under rubble, protected from complete disintegration by their position and weight. Today, within and behind the niches, archaeologists can still enter narrow tunnels that once allowed workers to climb through the statue during construction. These tunnels cut through the cliff reveal internal layers of stone and collapsed plaster. They also show how carefully the engineering had been planned to support such a massive figure without collapse during its original construction. Walking near the foot of the larger niche, you can still see fragments embedded in the ground sections of robe folds carved in stone, broken chunks of facial features, layers of plaster with faint traces of pigment. These are not museum pieces behind glass. They lie in the open, exposed to the weather, still part of the landscape where they were created. The valley itself feels vast and quiet. The cliffs stretch for hundreds of meters, dotted with the dark openings of cave chambers. Farmers work in the fields below. Children pass on footpaths. Life continues beside the remains of what was once one of the greatest artistic achievements of early Buddhist civilization. The contrast between daily life and monumental absence gives Bamiyan a unique emotional weight. The question of restoration has been debated for years. Some experts argue the Buddhas should be reconstructed as symbols of cultural healing. Others believe the empty niches themselves now carry historical meaning and should remain untouched as reminders of loss. Partial reconstructions using original fragments have been considered, but the scale and sensitivity of the site make any decision complex. What is certain is that Bamiyan is no longer only a story of destruction, it is also a story of survival through fragments. The caves still stand, the murals still survive in protected zones, the internal tunnels still exist, and parts of the statues, including massive components from their heads and upper bodies, still lie buried within the mountain. In ancient times, the giant Buddhas served as visual anchors for travelers crossing the harsh terrain of central Afghanistan. They signaled safety, settlement, and spiritual refuge. Their placement was not random. The valley offered water, fields, and shelter from surrounding mountains. The Buddhas marked this as a sacred and cultural center in a region otherwise defined by vast open space. The artistic style of the statues reflects the same cultural mixing seen at Hadda and Gandhara. The drapery of the robes followed Greco-Roman sculptural traditions. The facial expressions followed Indian Buddhist ideals. Even the construction techniques show influence from multiple regions. Bamiyan was not isolated from the ancient world. It was directly connected to it. Today, when you stand beneath the empty niches at sunset, the shadows move slowly across the carved stone. The scale remains overwhelming, even without the statues. The mountain still holds their outline. In a way, the Buddhas are still present through the negative space they left behind. The buried fragments inside the cliff, including the remains of their heads, represent something fragile but enduring. They remind us that even when monuments are destroyed, their material history does not vanish completely. It sinks into the earth, into the mountain, into the layers that archaeologists continue to study. The giant Buddha, head of Bamiyan, is not a single visible object today. It is a memory preserved in stone fragments, in tunnels, in rubble, and in the massive niches that frame an absence too large to ignore. It speaks not only of ancient devotion and engineering, but also of how history can be broken and still persist. This chapter of Bamiyan is unfinished. The valley continues to change. Research continues. Conservation efforts continue. And beneath the cliff face, inside the mountain itself, parts of the world's tallest ancient Buddha statues still remain where they fell, hidden, heavy, and silent. The stone masks of Coahuila, Mexico. Deep in the forests of southern Mexico, where where dense vegetation presses in from every side and humidity hangs heavy in the air. There is an ancient city that once stood at the edge of the Maya world. Today it is quiet, reached by narrow roads and footpaths, far from the crowds that gather at more famous sites. This place is known as Kohunlich. What makes Kohunlich different from nearly every other Maya center is a set of enormous stone and stucco masks, still attached to the walls of a pyramid, their faces watching silently from the jungle. When you approach the main structure where the masks are located, the sound of insects fills the air. The forest floor is uneven. Roots spread across the ground. At first, the pyramid appears like a broad stone mound rising out of greenery, but as you step closer, the shapes of faces begin to emerge from the shadows. Large eyes, broad noses, heavy headdresses. These are the sun god masks of Kohunlich, some of the most striking surviving examples of early Maya stucco sculpture. Each mask is several meters tall. They are not carved from solid stone like statues. Instead, they were built directly into the sides of the pyramid, using limestone blocks as a base, then covered with thick layers of mottled stucco. The surface was once painted in bright colors, reds, blues, yellows, and blacks, though today only faint traces of pigment remain in protected areas. The masks were created during the early phases of Maya civilization, around the late pre-classic to early classic period. This was a time when Maya cities were still forming their identities, before the great dynasties of the classic era rose to power. Kohunlich was one of the important regional centers during this transitional period. Each mask depicts a stylized solar deity. The wide eyes, curling elements around the mouth, and heavy headdresses all point toward the sun as a central symbol. The sun was not only a source of light and heat, it was a powerful god connected to kingship, agriculture, time, and cosmic order. By embedding these masks directly into the pyramid walls, the builders turned the entire structure into a series of divine faces. Standing in front of one of the masks, the scale becomes immediate. The mask is far taller than a human. The eyes alone are as wide as a person's shoulders. The mouth forms a deep hollow. The edges of the headdress project outward. Even though erosion has softened many details, the face remains readable. It does not feel decorative. It feels monumental. The placement of the masks is deliberate. They line the stairway that once led up the Apo pyramid. Anyone approaching the temple would have walked between these giant faces, moving upward through a corridor of divine imagery. This created a powerful visual experience. The ascent toward the summit became a symbolic journey through the presence of the sun god. Unlike later Maya, monumental architecture, which often features stone-carved inscriptions naming rulers and dates, the masks at Kohunlich are anonymous. They carry no recorded names. No known texts explain who commissioned them. Their meaning is communicated purely through form and placement. The construction process behind the masks was complex. First, the builders constructed the pyramid core from limestone blocks and rubble. Then, they shaped the mask figures using rough stone as an internal structure. After that, thick layers of wet stucco were modeled by hand into detailed facial features. This stucco was applied in stages, allowing artisans to shape curves, ridges, and recesses with precision. Stucco is not permanent like stone. It cracks, flakes, and erodes over time, especially in humid environments. The survival of these masks for more than 1,000 years is remarkable. Their preservation is partly due to the fact that later construction phases covered some of them, protecting them from rain and wind for centuries. When archaeologists excavated the pyramid, several of the masks were revealed from beneath these later layers. Walking along the base of the pyramid today, you can see masks in different states of preservation. Some are nearly complete, others are fragmentary. One mask might preserve a full eye and headdress, but lack the mouth. Another might retain only the central facial area. Together, they form a sequence that shows both the original grandeur and the effects of time. The identity of the sun god represented here is still debated. Some scholars associate the masks with early forms of Kanich Aja, the Maya sun deity linked to royal power. Others see elements of earlier pre-Maya solar symbolism adapted into the later tradition. What remains clear is that solar imagery was central to the identity of Kohunlich at this time. The pyramid itself was not only a visual monument, it was part of a larger ceremonial complex. The surrounding plazas, residential zones, and water reservoirs show that Kohunlich supported a substantial population. The city's location near lowland trade routes allowed it to control movement between the Caribbean coast and the interior regions of the Maya world. Water storage was especially important here. The region lacks major rivers. Rainfall is seasonal. The builders created reservoirs and channel systems to collect and store rainwater. This allowed Kohunlik to function year-round, even during dry seasons. The presence of large ceremonial architecture alongside practical water systems shows how closely ritual and survival were connected. Standing in the plaza below the masked pyramid, you begin to see how these structures shaped public life. Ceremonies likely took place at the foot of the stairway. Processions moved upward past the faces of the sun god. Priests and elites reached the summit to perform rituals overlooking the assembled population below. The masks created a visual boundary between the everyday world and the sacred space above. The faces themselves carry layered symbolism. The large eyes may reference solar radiance. The curling elements around the mouth could represent breath, wind, or life force. The headdresses include stylized elements that resemble feathers, flames, or celestial motifs. Even without texts, the visual language communicates power, vitality, and cosmic authority. As sunlight moves across the pyramid through the day, the masks change in character. In the early morning, shadows deepen the hollows of eyes and mouths. At noon, the faces flatten in bright light. In late afternoon, the features glow softly as the sun drops toward the horizon. This interaction between light and sculpture likely mattered to the ancient builders. These were solar faces responding directly to the movement of the sun. The city of Kohunlik eventually declined. Political power shifted to other Maya centers. Trade routes changed. The population decreased. By the late Classic period, some of the ceremonial spaces were abandoned. Jungle reclaimed the buildings. Tree roots broke through floors. Soil filled stairways. The masks disappeared beneath layers of vegetation and collapse. When modern archaeologists rediscovered the site in the 20th century, the masks were among the most dramatic finds. Excavation carefully removed overburden while stabilizing the fragile stucco. Conservation teams coated vulnerable areas to slow further erosion. Even today, preservation remains a constant struggle against humidity, rain, and biological growth. Walking close to the masks, you can see cracks running through the surfaces. In some places, the stucco has separated from its stone backing. Small plants grow in crevices. Conservation work has halted the worst damage, but the environment continues to act on the materials. Despite this fragility, the emotional weight of the masks remains strong. Unlike statues in museums, these faces still occupy their original place on the pyramid. They face the same plaza they faced centuries ago. The forest surrounds them now, but their relationship to the space is unchanged. The masks also offer insight into the evolution of Maya architecture. In later centuries, sculptural decoration moved away from large stucco masks toward carved stone stelae and relief panels. The Kohunlik masks belong to a moment when architecture itself was used as the primary medium of divine imagery. They also reflect a community still defining its identity. Kohunlik was not yet dominated by dynastic inscriptions or portrait stelae. The focus here was on shared cosmic symbols rather than named rulers. The sun, the pyramid, and the communal ritual took precedence over individual authority. The surrounding jungle heightens the sense of isolation. Birds call from the canopy. Insects hum constantly. The air shifts with sudden rain showers. The masks endure these conditions day after day, much as they have for more than a millennium. Their survival feels almost accidental, yet they remain among the most powerful faces in all of Mesoamerican archaeology. As you stand at the foot of the pyramid and look up at the giant stucco face emerging from greenery and stone, the gap between past and present narrows. The builders carved a god into architecture. The jungle tried to erase it. Time softened its features, but the face still looks outward, holding its place between the forest floor and the sky. The stone masks of Kohunlik are not the largest sculptures of the Maya world. They are not covered in writing. They do not belong to a famous royal dynasty. Yet their presence is unforgettable. They show how early Maya communities used architecture not just to support buildings, but to embody the forces they believed shaped the universe. Here, the sun did not only rise and set above the city. It rose and set through the face of a god built into stone, the rock-cut city of Dera, Turkey. On the dry plains of southeastern Turkey, only a few kilometers from the modern Syrian border, there is a landscape that appears open, quiet, and ordinary. Low hills roll across the horizon. Stone fields stretch in every direction. Scattered ruins sit beneath the sky. But beneath this surface lies one of the most complex underground cities ever carved by human hands. This place is known as Dara, and what hides below it is not a simple cave system, but a vast necropolis and infrastructure network shaped into bedrock like a maze. From above, Dara looks like many other ancient ruins. Broken walls, collapsed towers, and foundation lines trace the outline of a long-lost city. But as you begin to descend into the rock-cut chambers beneath it, the scale changes completely. Stairways plunge into darkness. Corridors branch in multiple directions. Vaulted ceilings rise above stone-cut floors. What first appears to be a ruin quickly reveals itself as a carefully planned underground world. Dara was founded in the 5th century CE during the reign of the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire. It was built as a fortress city on the empire's eastern frontier, directly facing the Persian Sasanian world. Above ground, Dara was a heavily defended military base. Below ground, it became something even more unusual, one of the largest carved necropolises in the region, designed to house the dead on a massive scale. As you step into the underground chambers today, the temperature immediately drops. The air becomes cooler and heavier. Sound changes. Footsteps echo differently. Light fades quickly. These spaces were not carved for comfort or habitation. They were cut for permanence and containment. The walls are vertical. The ceilings are high. The stone surfaces still show tool marks from ancient chisels. One of the first chambers you encounter is a massive vaulted hall lined with carved burial niches. These niches form stacked rows from floor to ceiling. Each one once held a body. Some were sealed with stone slabs. Others were covered with wooden boards that have long since decayed. The number of individuals buried here reaches into the tens of thousands. This was not a small cemetery. This was a city of the dead. Walking deeper into the necropolis, you see how the chambers connect. Narrow passageways lead to wider halls. Vertical shafts drop into lower levels. Some rooms open suddenly into vast spaces, where the ceiling curves high above like a cathedral, carved underground. These spaces were shaped entirely by removing stone. Nothing was built. Everything was cut away. The organization of the necropolis reveals careful planning. Graves are grouped. Passages flow in controlled directions. Certain chambers appear reserved for specific families or social groups. Others hold long rows, intended for mass burial during times of war or disease. The layout reflects both order and urgency. A system designed to cope with sudden large-scale death. Dara's position on the frontier made it vulnerable to constant siege and conflict. Over centuries, the city was attacked repeatedly by Persian armies and later by Arab forces. Epidemics, sieges, and warfare would have caused sudden spikes in mortality. The underground necropolis allowed the city to manage death discreetly, without overwhelming the surface spaces. But the underground network was not used only for burial. As exploration continued beneath Dara, archaeologists discovered vast cisterns carved deep into the earth. These cisterns are enormous. Some are nearly 20 meters deep, with stone-cut stairways descending to the water level. Their walls are smooth. Their bases are wide. Rainwater and groundwater were collected here to sustain the city during long sieges. These cisterns were engineering achievements in their own right. The builders understood how to stabilize stone under pressure, how to prevent collapse, and how to minimize water loss. Channels carved into the rock directed rainfall into storage. The city could survive for months without outside water supply. In one area, the underground chambers shift in function entirely. Instead of burial niches or water storage, you find a rock-cut church. Its apse is carved into the stone. The altar platform rises from the floor. Side chambers likely served as small chapels or clergy spaces. Even underground, religious life continued alongside burial and survival infrastructure. Walking through this space, you begin to realize that the underground city was not simply a hidden layer. It was a full extension of life above. Death, water supply, worship, and movement all occurred beneath the surface. In times of siege, the population may have taken shelter in these lower levels, protected from attack while accessing water and religious support. The most striking space below Dara is often called the Great Gallery. This long, towering corridor stretches forward with burial niches lining both sides from floor to ceiling. Thousands of stone-cut openings stare outward from the walls. The corridor narrows and widens in rhythm as it moves forward. Light from the entrance fades as you walk, replaced by deep shadow. Standing in this gallery, the scale feels overwhelming. Each niche represents one person. A single corridor may hold several thousand burials. Multiply that across the necropolis, and you begin to understand how closely life and death were intertwined in this frontier city. The stone used for these carvings is limestone, relatively soft when first cut, but hardening over time. This allowed the builders to excavate efficiently while still creating durable structures. Even after 15 centuries, the walls remain stable, the tool marks are still visible, the geometry of the chambers is still clean. Above ground, Dara was surrounded by massive defensive walls, towers, and gates. One of the most impressive surface structures is the remains of the city's aqueduct and dam system, which controlled floodwaters and supplied the cisterns below. The coordination between above-ground and below-ground systems shows advanced urban planning. The underground levels also include sheltered passageways that allowed movement between different sectors of the city without exposure. During sieges, this would have been critical. Civilians could move between water storage, religious spaces, and protected areas without crossing open streets. Over time, Dara fell to repeated invasions. The city changed hands multiple times. Eventually, its strategic value faded. Trade routes shifted, populations moved, the surface city declined and partially collapsed. But the underground levels remained sealed and hidden, preserved by the very earth they were carved into. For centuries, the underground necropolis of Dara was forgotten. Local legends spoke of tunnels and hidden chambers, but few understood the full scale of what lay beneath. It was only through modern archaeological work that the full extent began to emerge. As excavations expanded, new corridors were opened, new chambers revealed. Each layer added depth to the story of how this city functioned during both peace and war. The relationship between the living surface city and the silent underground layers became clearer with every discovery. Walking back toward the surface from deep inside Dara, the light gradually returns. The air warms. The echo of footsteps changes again. You emerge into open ruins, into sunlight and wind, into a city that once relied completely on what now lies hidden beneath it. Dara does not impress with soaring temples or carved statues. Its power lies in what it conceals, rather than what it displays. It is monumental through excavation rather than elevation. A city built downward instead of upward. The rock-cut city of Dara shows how ancient societies prepared not just for daily life, but for survival under extreme pressure. It shows how death was managed at industrial scale. It shows how water, worship, and security were woven into a single underground network. Even now, only a fraction of Dara's subsurface has been fully explored. Many tunnels remain sealed. Many chambers remain filled with debris. The full extent of the underground network is still unknown. What is certain is that this was not an accidental system. It was planned. It was engineered. It was used over centuries. And it remains one of the clearest examples of how a city can exist on two levels at once, one in the open air and one carved silently into the earth below. The rock-cut city of Dara stands today as a reminder that some of the largest and most complex human constructions were never meant to be seen from afar. They were meant to be entered slowly, in darkness, step by step, through corridors that lead not upward into the sky, but downward into stone. The rock temples of Dambulla, Sri Lanka. In the central plains of Sri Lanka, where dry forest spreads across flat land and rock outcrops rise unexpectedly from the earth, a massive granite hill stands above the surrounding countryside. From below, it looks like a natural formation shaped only by time and erosion. But carved deep into its face is one of the most important and long-used religious complexes in South Asia. This place is known today as the Dambulla Cave Temple, and inside its stone chambers are some of the largest and most enduring Buddha sculptures ever created in living rock. The climb to the cave temples is gradual but deliberate. A long path winds upward along the slope. Trees thin out as you rise higher. The air becomes warmer and drier. From the approach alone, the site feels intentionally removed from the ordinary world below. By the time you reach the main entrances, the surrounding land is already far beneath your feet. The temple complex is made up of 5 large caves, carved entirely into the cliff face. These are not shallow shelters. Each cave is deep, broad, and carefully shaped. Over more than 2,000 years, these spaces have been reshaped, repainted, restored, and expanded, yet they remain anchored inside the same mountain. The earliest use of Dambulla as a sanctuary goes back over 2,000 years. Long before it became a royal temple complex, this hill served as a place of refuge. According to tradition, a Sri Lankan king once took shelter here while fleeing enemies. After regaining his throne, he transformed the caves into a permanent Buddhist sanctuary. From that moment onward, kings, monks, and artisans continued adding to the site through many generations. Stepping into the first cave, the change in sound is immediate. The noise of the outside world fades. The air cools slightly. The smell of stone and incense settles in. Directly ahead, carved into the rock floor and wall, lie massive reclining Buddha figures. These statues are not separate constructions placed inside the cave. They are carved directly from the rock itself, emerging from the mountain as if the stone itself is lying in meditation. The largest reclining Buddha stretches over 14 meters long. The proportions are calm and balanced. The expression is composed. The hands are placed carefully. The robe is carved in, smooth, flowing lines that suggest fabric rather than rigid stone. The figure rests beneath a painted ceiling, filled with repeating patterns and symbolic imagery. As you move from one cave to the next, the scale of the complex becomes more apparent. Across the 5 main caves, there are more than 150 Buddha statues, along with dozens of images of kings, monks, and guardians. Some Buddhas are seated in meditation, others stand upright, some recline. Together they form a complete visual narrative of Buddhist ideals expressed entirely in stone and paint. The cave walls and ceilings are covered with murals. These are not simple decorations. They cover thousands of square meters and portray scenes from the life of the Buddha, past life stories, historical processions, and symbolic cosmology. Even after centuries of repainting and restoration, the murals still retain strong color and clarity. The imagery flows continuously across curved ceilings and uneven rock surfaces, adapting naturally to the stone rather than fighting it. What makes Dambulla unique is not only the number of statues, but the fact that the entire complex exists inside a single natural rock formation. Unlike structural temples built from stacked stone blocks, these spaces were created by removing rock rather than assembling it. The mountain was hollowed out, shaped, and refined over centuries. This method required a deep understanding of stone behavior. The ceilings had to remain stable. Weight, distribution had to be controlled. Cracks had to be avoided or redirected. Even today, the stability of these caves after 2,000 years speaks to the care taken during carving. One important feature of Dambulla is its water system. At the highest point of the cliff, a natural spring drips constantly through the stone. This water has been guided into a controlled drip that feeds small channels and stone basins within the complex. This natural water source allowed the cave temples to function even during dry seasons. The presence of naturally flowing water also carried deep symbolic meaning in Buddhist ritual life. In the second cave, one of the largest chambers, dozens of Buddha statues sit in long rows. Some are serene and simple. Others are surrounded by carved halos and attendants. At the center of this cave stands a large seated Buddha prepared for festival display with offerings placed before it. Along the walls stand images of ancient Sri Lankan kings who supported the temple. Their inclusion shows how closely royal authority and religious devotion were linked. Throughout the complex, you notice how the artists adapted their work to the stone, rather than reshaping the stone unnaturally. Pillars are not constructed separately but carved from the same rock as the ceilings and floors. Doorways are cut directly through stone partitions. Relief figures rise smoothly from solid walls. Unlike many ancient Buddhist sites that fell into ruin after religious shifts, Dambulla never stopped functioning. For more than 2 millennia, monks have lived, prayed, painted, and repaired within these caves. This continuous use is one reason the site remains so intact today. It was never truly abandoned. Walking through the caves, you can see layers of history stacked visually. Some statues are older, with more rigid proportions and simpler expressions. Others are later additions with more fluid carving and elaborate painted detail. Some murals follow early South Asian styles. Others show influence from later Sri Lankan kingdoms and regional artistic changes. The paint layers themselves tell a story. Over centuries, ceilings were repainted again and again. Each generation refreshed the imagery according to the artistic conventions of its time. In some places, you can see older paint beneath newer layers where flaking has occurred. This creates a visual record of religious continuity rather than replacement. From outside the caves, the view across the plains is wide and quiet. Fields stretch to the horizon. Low villages and roads trace faint lines across the land. From this height, the surrounding world feels distant. This separation likely contributed to the choice of Dambulla as a spiritual center. It allowed monks to live above daily distractions while remaining connected to the people below. The statues themselves were not carved in a single phase. Some are early, others date to medieval periods. The oldest may be more than 2,000 years old, while the most recent additions are only a few centuries old. Yet they coexist harmoniously within the same chambers, creating a space where different eras of devotion overlap. The faces of the Buddhas at Dambulla share a common calm. The eyes are often half closed. The lips show gentle restraint. The body posture is relaxed, but balanced. This consistency across centuries suggests a long-held artistic ideal that transcended political change. Standing inside the largest cave today, it is easy to forget that you are inside a natural mountain. The walls feel architectural. The ceilings feel intentional. Only the uneven stone textures remind you that this space was not built in layers but carved inwards from a solid mass. Dambulla also reflects how religion adapts to geography. Instead of building upward with towers and spires, this sanctuary turned inward. Instead of shaping stone into external monuments, it embraced the shelter of the mountain. In a tropical climate with monsoon rains, the caves provided natural protection that freestanding buildings could not always guarantee. Over time, Dambulla became a central pilgrimage site. Monks traveled here for study and retreat. Kings visited to offer donations. Local communities gathered for festivals. The caves became part of daily religious life across generations. Even today, the site remains active. Monks continue to reside here. Incense still burns. Offerings still rest at the feet of the statues. The sound of chanting still echoes against the stone. This continuous use creates a rare connection between ancient and modern spiritual practice. From an archaeological perspective, Dambulla is exceptional not because it represents a lost civilization, but because it represents an uninterrupted one. The same caves carved over 2,000 years ago are still used for the same fundamental purpose today. As you move toward the exit of the final cave and step back into daylight, the brightness feels sudden. The heat of the plain returns. The forest sounds reappear. Behind you, the stone chambers close into shadow once more, holding their statues quietly in the dark interior of the mountain. The rock temples of Dambulla are not ruins in the usual sense. They are not abandoned. They are living stone spaces where time has layered itself instead of erasing what came before. They show how human belief can shape not only buildings and cities, but entire mountains. Here, faith did not rise into the sky through towers. It moved inward, carving itself into the earth, and remaining there for more than 2,000 years. The forgotten city of Timgad, Algeria. On the high plateau of eastern Algeria, where the land stretches wide beneath an open sky, and the edge of the Sahara begins to show itself in dry winds and pale soil, a Roman city lies uncovered in stone. From above, it looks almost unreal, a perfect grid of streets, squares, and buildings preserved so clearly that the plan of the city can still be read like a map drawn into the earth. This is Timgad, also known in antiquity as Thamugadi, a Roman colony founded nearly 2,000 years ago and then slowly erased by sand. When you arrive at Timgad today, what strikes you first is not its size, but its order. Straight roads intersect at right angles. Long avenues stretch toward the horizon. The remains of temples, baths, markets, libraries, houses, and a massive theater rise from the ground in clean geometric alignment. It does not look like a ruin shaped by accident. It looks like a city paused in time. Timgad was founded around the year 100 CE, under the reign of the Roman Emperor Trajan. Unlike older cities that grew organically over centuries, Timgad was planned from the beginning as a complete Roman colony. It followed the classic Roman grid system, with two main streets crossing at the center, the Cardo running north to south, and the Decumanus running east to west. From this crossing point, the entire city expanded outward in an orderly pattern. The purpose of Timgad was not only administrative, it was designed as a settlement for retired Roman soldiers. These veterans were given land and homes in exchange for a lifetime of service. The city became a symbol of Roman order imposed upon the landscapes of North Africa, blending military discipline with civilian life. Walking along the central avenue today, you follow the same route that soldiers, merchants, officials, and families followed nearly 2 millennia ago. The road surface still shows the grooves worn by cartwheels. Stone curbs line the edges. In places, drainage channels run alongside the street, showing how carefully water was controlled in a dry environment. At the heart of the city stands the Forum, the civic center, where political, legal, and commercial life once unfolded. Broken columns surround the plaza. The foundations of government buildings outline spaces where magistrates once met and citizens gathered. The scale of the Forum shows that this was not a minor outpost. It was a fully developed Roman city built to last. Nearby rises the great theater of Timgad. Its seating tiers climb up the slope of a gentle hill, facing a wide stage. Even now, the structure can seat thousands. From the upper rows, the vast plains stretch into the distance. Performances here would have combined drama, music, and public ceremony with this immense open backdrop. The acoustics remain surprisingly clear even today. Behind the theater, residential districts spread in regular blocks. Rows of homes open onto straight streets. Many houses had interior courtyards, private baths, and decorative mosaics. Some floors still preserve fragments of geometric patterns and plant motifs. These were not temporary shelters. They were permanent stone houses, built for long-term urban life. The presence of multiple bath complexes reveals how central public bathing was to daily routine. Cold rooms, warm rooms, and hot rooms stood side by side, heated by underground furnace systems. The ruins of these heating systems can still be traced. Hot air once circulated beneath raised floors, warming stone chambers in a city that experienced cold winters despite its proximity to the desert. One of the most remarkable aspects of Timgad is its library. Archaeological excavations uncovered a rectangular building with large niches in the walls where scrolls were once stored. This is one of the best preserved examples of a Roman public library in North Africa. It shows that Timgad was not only a military and trade center, but also a place of learning and administration. Religion shaped the urban layout as well. Temples dedicated to Roman gods once stood at major intersections. Over time, as Christianity spread, churches were built within the city. Remains of basilicas, baptismal fonts, and Christian inscriptions reveal how religious identity shifted without erasing the physical fabric of the Roman city. Timgad also tells a story of adaptation. The city was built in a region that experienced both hot summers and cold winters. The Romans used thick stone walls for insulation. Courtyards allowed airflow. Water was brought to the city through aqueducts from distant sources. Cisterns stored water for dry periods. Every aspect of the city reflected engineering designed for endurance. For centuries, Timgad prospered. Trade connected it to the Mediterranean world. Agricultural goods flowed in from the surrounding countryside. Craftsmen worked in workshops along the streets. Markets filled the city squares. Life here followed the rhythms of a fully Romanized provincial society, but history did not move gently through this region. In the 5th century CE, the Western Roman Empire began to fragment. Timgad faced invasions from multiple directions. The Vandals swept through North Africa, followed later by the Byzantines, who reclaimed parts of the region. The city was damaged, repaired, damaged, again. Its population declined, but it did not vanish immediately. The final transformation came with the arrival of Arab armies in the 7th century. The political and cultural center of the region shifted. Trade routes changed. New cities rose elsewhere. Timgad, no longer at the heart of power, slowly emptied. Buildings collapsed. Roofs fell in. Streets filled with debris. Then the desert began its steady work. Over centuries, wind-blown sand filled the abandoned streets. Walls disappeared beneath dunes. Structures were buried layer by layer. Unlike cities that are continuously rebuilt, on top of older layers, Timgad was largely left alone. The sand acted as a protective blanket, sealing the Roman city beneath it. By the time European explorers reached the region in the 18th and 19th centuries, only fragments of arches and columns were visible on the surface. The rest of the city lay hidden below. When systematic excavation began, archaeologists realized they were uncovering not scattered ruins, but an entire Roman city frozen beneath the desert. As the sand was removed, streets emerged intact. The forum reappeared. The theater took shape. House blocks unfolded one by one. The precision of the original city plan became visible again after more than 1,000 years of burial. Walking through Timgad today is unlike walking through most ancient ruins. The layout is still readable as a living city. You do not just see isolated monuments. You walk along street networks. You pass from residential zones into market areas, from baths into religious spaces. The structure of daily life is still visible in stone. In the early morning or late afternoon, when the sun casts long shadows across the ruins, the grid of streets becomes even clearer. Rectangular building outlines stretch across the plain. Doorways open onto empty interiors. The silence is broken only by wind and distant birds. What makes Timgad especially powerful is this sense of urban completeness. Many ancient cities survive only as partial remains. Timgad survives as a plan. It allows us to understand not just monumental architecture, but how an ordinary Roman town actually functioned. You can trace the route of water from aqueduct to cistern. You can see where merchants sold goods along the main avenues. You can identify quiet residential areas away from noisy public spaces. Even without roofs or walls at full height, the skeleton of the city remains legible. One of the most iconic structures at Timgad is the Arch of Trajan. Rising at the western end of the main street, this monumental gateway once marked the entrance to the city. Its 3 great arches framed the road, creating a ceremonial threshold between the surrounding countryside and the urban interior. Even in ruin, the arch still defines the scale of Timgad's ambition. Beyond the arch, the grid continues outward, beyond the original enclosure. As the city grew, new neighborhoods were added. The strict, square plan stretched further across the plateau. This expansion shows that Timgad was not static. It grew with its population and prosperity. Christian Timgad also left deep marks. Several churches were built within the old Roman grid. One large basilica stands near the center of the city. Nearby, inscriptions in Latin and early Christian symbols mark the transformation of belief within familiar Roman settings. Pagan temples were not always destroyed. Some were repurposed. Others were simply left to decay as new religious centers grew. The city also contains traces of conflict between religious communities. Inscriptions refer to disputes between Catholics and Donatists, a Christian group that split from the main church in North Africa. These social tensions played out within the same streets originally designed for Roman civic life. Timgad eventually became a quiet, provincial town before disappearing entirely beneath sand. No dramatic fire destroyed it. No sudden catastrophe erased it. It faded slowly, one generation at a time, until no one remained to clear streets or repair walls. The desert completed what history began. Ancient city of Karakoto, Mongolia, on the far western edge of the Gobi Desert, where the land flattens into endless dust and the wind moves without obstacle for hundreds of kilometers. The ruins of a forgotten city rise quietly from the sand. Its walls are broken. Its streets are buried. Its buildings have collapsed inward. This place is known as Karakoto, once a thriving fortress city, now reduced to silence by centuries of abandonment and sandstorms. From a distance, Karakoto appears as a low rectangular outline barely distinguishable from the surrounding desert. The city walls once stood high and strong, built to defend against attack. Today, only eroded segments remain, their edges softened by wind and heat. Yet even in ruin, the scale of the enclosure is clear. This was not a small outpost. It was a fully planned urban stronghold. Karakoto was founded around the 11th century as a Tangut city, part of the Western Shah kingdom. This kingdom stood between powerful neighbors, including the Song dynasty to the south and the Mongol tribes to the north. Karakoto's position made it both valuable and vulnerable. It sat along major desert trade routes, linking China, Central Asia, and the Silk Road network. Merchants once passed through its gates carrying silk, tea, metal goods, and manuscripts. Caravans relied on the city as a stop for water, rest, and security. Inside the walls, markets operated. Soldiers guarded the defenses. Monks copied texts, and families lived daily life far from the greener heartlands. Walking through the ruins today, the ground is uneven with collapsed brick, pottery fragments, and sand-packed debris. Wind moves freely through what were once narrow streets. The outlines of houses remain visible as low earthen shapes. In some areas, The grid of the city can still be traced beneath shifting dunes. The construction of Karakoto was typical of frontier desert cities. Its walls were made of rammed earth, reinforced with timber. Thick and massive, they could absorb impact and resist siege. 4 main gates opened toward the cardinal directions. Towers once stood at regular intervals along the walls, allowing archers to defend every approach. Inside, the walls stood government buildings, religious structures, storage facilities, and homes. Archaeological excavations revealed Buddhist temples, administrative offices, and residential areas arranged in functional zones. The city was not chaotic. It was organized for long-term occupation. Water was always the central challenge. Karakoto depended on a river system that once flowed closer to the city than it does today. Canals were dug to channel water into reservoirs and storage pools. Wells were also cut deep into the earth. Without this water management, the city could not have survived in such a dry region. For centuries, the system worked. Agriculture supported the population. Trade enriched the city. Karakoto became an important military and economic hub on the desert frontier. Then the political world around it shifted. In the early 13th century, the Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan swept across Central Asia. The Western Xia kingdom fell after brutal campaigns. Karakoto survived the initial destruction, but eventually became part of the expanding Mongol world. Under Mongol rule, the city continued to function for a time. Trade flows resumed under the safety of imperial roads. Buddhist monasteries remained active. New administrative systems were introduced. But the balance that had sustained the city was fragile. The real enemy of Karakoto was not invasion. It was the desert itself. Over generations, river channels shifted. Water sources weakened. Canals dried up. Without consistent water supply, agriculture became unreliable. The population shrank. Trade declined. Maintenance of walls and homes slowed. As fewer people remained to repair structures, the desert began to reclaim what humans had built. Sandstorms became more destructive. Dunes advanced into streets. Roofs collapsed under drifting sand. Storage chambers filled. Eventually, entire neighborhoods were buried. Families left, in small groups. The city thinned out quietly, rather than disappearing in a single catastrophe. By the 15th century, Karakoto was effectively abandoned. The wind continued its work for hundreds of years. Sand piled higher. Walls sank beneath dunes. Only fragments of towers and the tops of structures remained visible. Travelers passed through the region, unaware that a city lay buried beneath their feet. Karakoto entered legend as the Black City, a place whispered about in Mongolian folklore. Stories spoke of a lost fortress swallowed by sand. Some tales described sudden destruction. Others spoke of curses. None captured the slow reality of abandonment and environmental collapse. Modern rediscovery came only in the early 20th century, when Russian explorers began surveying the region. As they excavated through dunes, walls emerged. Streets appeared. Temples surfaced. What they uncovered was not a ruin shaped by fire, but a city preserved by burial. Perhaps the most remarkable discoveries at Karakoto were not architectural, but written. Large numbers of manuscripts were found inside collapsed buildings, preserved by the dry desert conditions. These included Buddhist texts, administrative documents, personal letters, and printed books. Many of these documents were written in the Tangut language, a script that had largely vanished with the fall of the Western Xia kingdom. The manuscripts provided scholars with an unprecedented window into a lost civilization, its laws, religion, education, and daily economy. Inside one collapsed structure, archaeologists found shelves where books once stood. Inkstones lay nearby. Wooden printing blocks were buried in dust. This suggested that Karakoto was not just a military city but also a center of learning and religious scholarship. The Buddhist presence at Karakoto was strong. Stupas stood within the walls. Temple foundations remained visible. Small clay statues of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas were uncovered beneath debris. Meditation caves and prayer halls once served monks who lived alongside soldiers and merchants. The daily rhythm of the city would have balanced defense, trade, agriculture, and religious practice. Soldiers guarded the walls. Farmers worked nearby fields, near canal-fed plots. Merchants traded goods from distant lands. Priests performed rituals inside temples. Karakoto was a frontier city, but not an isolated one. Walking across the ruins today, the silence is heavy. The wind pushes sand across broken bricks. No water flows through the canals. The wells are dry. The vast sky presses down on the empty enclosure. It is difficult to imagine that thousands of people once lived here, yet the structure of their world remains in fragments. Doorways still outline rooms. Streets still guide your steps. Walls still mark boundaries. In certain light, the city layout becomes visible again, as if the sand briefly loosens its grip. Kara-Koto shows a different kind of disappearance. Unlike cities destroyed by fire or conquest, this one faded through environmental change and gradual abandonment. It was not erased overnight. It was undone over generations, as the systems that sustained it quietly failed. This slow disappearance may be why so much of Karakoto survived. No invading army flattened its libraries. No rebuilding erased its older layers. Instead, the desert simply covered it, holding its remains in place beneath protective sand. Even today, only portions of the city have been fully excavated. Large areas remain buried. Each sandstorm shifts the landscape slightly, revealing new fragments while hiding others. The city still moves slowly beneath the dunes. Standing at the edge of the ruins as the sun lowers, the walls cast soft shadows across the desert floor. The color of the earth deepens. The air cools. The vast emptiness makes the city feel distant in both space and time. Karakoto was once a place of trade, worship, defense, and learning at the edge of the known world. Now it is a quiet enclosure in the sand, remembered through broken walls and buried books. The ancient city of Karakoto remains one of the clearest examples of how entire urban worlds can be erased, not by war, but by the slow certainty of environmental change. It reminds us that even stone walls and fortified cities depend ultimately on fragile resources like water, maintenance, and people willing to stay. Here, the desert did not crash through the gates. It simply waited. The giant granite sarcophagus of the Serapeum, Egypt, 35-minute calm, human, continuous documentary narration. Beneath the desert plateau of northern Egypt, far below the sand and limestone streets of one of the world's oldest necropolises, lies a tunnel system that still unsettles even experienced archaeologists. The air is heavy. The ceilings are low. The walls press in from both sides, and inside these corridors sit some of the largest, most precisely carved stone objects ever created in the ancient world. This place is the Serapeum of Saqqara, and along its underground, galleries rest more than 24 massive granite sarcophagi, each weighing close to 100 tons. The Serapeum is not visible from the surface. There is no towering monument above ground marking its location. Instead, a narrow entry shaft leads down into darkness beneath the sands of Saqqara. Once, inside, the temperature drops. The sounds of the surface disappear. Stone footsteps echo through long corridors that stretch into shadow. At the end of these tunnels, the granite boxes emerge one by one from the darkness. Each sits inside its own carved chamber. Each box is shaped from a single, solid block of granite. Each lid is equally massive, and each is cut with an accuracy so fine that the interior surfaces appear polished to a mirror-like finish. These are not symbolic containers. They are physical machines of stone. Their edges are straight. Their corners are sharp. Their walls are perfectly flat. Even today, with modern measuring tools, many of the surfaces fall within extremely tight tolerances. When you stand next to one of these boxes, scale becomes difficult to process. The lids alone weigh more than most modern trucks. The full sarcophagus, lid and base combined, can approach the weight of a fully loaded commercial aircraft, and all of this was carved, transported, lowered, aligned, and sealed underground more than 2,300 years ago. The Serapeum was constructed during the late period of ancient Egypt, primarily under the rule of the 26th dynasty, though earlier structures existed on the site. It was built to house the sacred Apis bulls, living embodiments of the god Ptah, later associated with Osiris after death. Each Apis bull was worshipped during its lifetime, and then mummified and buried with enormous ceremony after death. These bulls were not symbolic animals. They were central religious figures. Entire priesthoods served them. When one bull died, a nationwide search began for the next calf, with the correct sacred markings. When the next bull was found, the cycle of worship continued. But the burial of a dead Apis bull was one of the most important religious events in the Egyptian calendar. The earliest Apis burials were modest, but over time, the scale increased dramatically. By the time the Serapeum was expanded into its final monumental form, each Apis bull was placed into a granite sarcophagus beyond anything previously attempted in Egyptian funerary architecture. The boxes we see today line a central underground corridor, each one occupying its own chamber like silent machines in a stone factory. Some chambers were sealed after burial, others were breached in antiquity. A few remain almost untouched, since the day they were closed, when French archaeologist Auguste Mariette rediscovered the Serapeum in 1851 after following the trail of Sphinx statues buried in sand. He expected to find a typical necropolis. Instead, he uncovered an underground world that defied every expectation. Inside, the coffers were not royal mummies. They were the remains of bulls, some wrapped in linen, some reduced to bone fragments, some missing entirely due to ancient looting. What mattered more than what was inside was the containers themselves. Each sarcophagus is carved from either red granite from Aswan or black granite from unknown quarries. Granite is one of the hardest stones available to ancient builders. It contains quartz crystals that rapidly destroy copper tools. Even today, granite requires modern steel and diamond-tipped machinery to shape efficiently. Yet here, the surfaces are flat to a level that challenges modern fabrication. The interiors are squared with extreme precision. The lids fit their bases so closely that even a sheet of paper cannot be inserted between them. Inside some chambers, the lid was slid perfectly into place and locked by its own massive weight. No mortar was used. No metal fasteners exist. Gravity alone sealed these boxes. This raises unavoidable technical questions. How were these blocks carved with such flatness? How were their interiors hollowed out with right angles and smooth floors? How were they transported into narrow underground corridors? How were they lifted and lowered into chambers with limited vertical clearance? The corridors themselves are not wide. In places, there is barely enough space for the sarcophagus to pass through with centimeters to spare on each side. The idea that these 100-ton monoliths were dragged through these tight spaces without grinding against the walls suggests careful planning and controlled movement at every stage. The chambers they sit in were carved specifically to receive each box. The floors are level. The walls fit closely around the sides. In many cases, the sarcophagi were likely lowered vertically into the chambers before the ceilings were fully completed, indicating that the entire tunnel system was planned around their final positions from the beginning. This was not an afterthought. It was an engineered underground installation built around monolithic machines of stone. The polishing alone is another mystery. Polishing granite to a mirror-like finish requires extended abrasion with hard materials. Even today, this process takes time, power, and industrial equipment. Yet the interior surfaces of the Serapeum boxes show consistent smoothness, even in corners and edges. Some researchers have suggested that abrasive sand slurries and long mechanical labor could explain the finish. Others note that the uniformity across all surfaces suggests controlled tooling rather than random abrasion. What remains certain is that the quality of these boxes far exceeds what was required for simple burial containers. Ordinary sarcophagi did not need this level of precision. These appear to have been made to exacting technical standards far beyond symbolic or ritual necessity. The deeper you move through the Serapeum, the more repetitive the pattern becomes. Box after box, chamber after chamber, each one nearly identical in scale and finish. This uniform repetition suggests standardized production over generations, and yet, no workshop has ever been found that explains how these exact boxes were made. On the walls above the chambers, inscriptions describe rituals, priestly lineages, and the names of rulers who participated in the burials. These texts confirm the religious purpose of the site, but they offer no technical explanation for the stonework itself. What is also striking is what is missing. No broken tools lie in the tunnels. No discarded blocks remain from failed attempts. The operation appears clean, controlled, and deliberate. The air inside the Serapeum today is still and dry. The darkness is nearly complete beyond the reach of artificial light. When you stand alone beside one of these sealed granite machines, the sensory experience becomes overwhelming. The sound of your breath echoes. The scale presses inward. The temperature stays constant. The box does not feel like a coffin. It feels like an engineered device that happens to contain a burial. Some of the sarcophagi were found empty. In a few cases, Lids had been slid aside in antiquity and never replaced. The reasons remain unclear. Was this looting, reuse, ritual relocation, or damage during late antiquity? The bull remains that were found inside some boxes were often fragmentary. This suggests that the mummification process did not always preserve the body fully, or that later disturbance occurred long before modern excavation. Above the Serapeum, the surface of Saqqara holds pyramids, mastabas, and temples spanning thousands of years. But beneath all of that sits this hidden world of granite machines, unseen by ordinary worshippers. The entrance itself was marked by sphinx-lined avenues, guiding priests and processions toward the underground complex. These sphinxes were later buried by shifting sands, hiding the Serapeum entirely until rediscovery in the 19th century. Even after more than a century of study, engineers still debate how the boxes were transported from Aswan, over 800 kilometers away, then dragged across desert terrain, lowered into trenches, moved through underground tunnels, and aligned so precisely inside their chambers. Ancient Egyptians were expert stone movers. They built pyramids, temples, obelisks, and colossi weighing hundreds of tons. But those structures were built in open space with ramps, levers, and thousands of workers. The Serapeum presents a different challenge. Extreme precision under extreme confinement, with no margin for error. A single uncontrolled shift would have destroyed a tunnel wall or trapped a box permanently in the corridor. Yet no such failures are visible. The Serapeum also differs emotionally from royal tombs. There is no decoration inside the chambers, no painted scenes, no symbolic carvings, just bare granite, dark corridors, and sealed stone volumes. The aesthetic is industrial rather than ceremonial. This creates a strange psychological effect. Even knowing the religious purpose, the environment feels mechanical, controlled, silent, repetitive. Over centuries, the cult of the Apis bull declined. New religious priorities emerged. The Serapeum was eventually abandoned. The entrance collapsed or was buried. Sand erased the surface markers. The underground world was sealed again by time. When it was rediscovered, many already wondered whether ancient technology had been underestimated. The site became a focal point for debate. Ritual engineering on an industrial scale. Modern scanning of the boxes shows slight variations in dimension, but extreme consistency in flatness and symmetry. Even tiny deviations appear intentional rather than accidental. Whether achieved through patient abrasion or lost techniques of stone machining, the result remains extraordinary. The giant carved face of Harakbut, Peru. Deep in the southeastern rainforests of Peru, far from paved roads and modern cities, there is a section of cliff that has quietly puzzled explorers, archaeologists, and local communities for generations. From certain angles, it appears natural, just another rock wall rising from dense jungle. But when light strikes it correctly, a human face emerges from the stone. Eyes, nose, mouth. The features are large, deliberate, and difficult to dismiss as random erosion. This is the giant carved face of the Harakbut territory, one of the least understood stone formations in South America. The site lies within the remote forests of Madre de Dios, one of the most biologically dense and difficult to access regions on the continent. Thick canopy blocks most sunlight. Rivers replace roads. Travel is slow, and many areas remain unreachable without long jungle treks. This isolation is one of the main reasons the stone face remained largely unknown to the outside world until relatively recently. For the indigenous Harakbut people, the face has never been a mystery. It has always been part of the landscape and their oral history. Elders describe it as an ancestral guardian watching over the forest. Some stories speak of an ancient being turned to stone. Others describe it as a marker left by a forgotten people before the forest reclaimed the land. These stories are not treated as legends in the usual sense. They are treated as inherited memory. The face itself is carved into a vertical rock wall roughly 30 meters above the forest floor. The cliff rises abruptly from the surrounding vegetation, making approach difficult. There is no broad clearing, no staircase, no obvious path leading to the carving. Reaching the base requires hours of jungle travel, followed by steep climbing over loose rock and roots. When you finally stand in front of the wall, the scale becomes clearer. The face is several meters tall. The eyes are deeply recessed. The nose projects outward. The mouth is long and shallow, carved cleanly across the surface. The proportions are unnatural for erosion, but consistent with intentional shaping. The stone surface around the face shows clear contrast between natural fracture lines and worked areas. The outer face is smoother than the surrounding cliff. The edges of the nose and eye sockets follow controlled curves rather than random breakage. In some areas, faint tool-like markings can still be seen, especially where weathering has been less aggressive. What makes this site unusual is not only the carving itself, but its location. Large-scale rock carvings of human faces are extremely rare in the Amazon basin. Most known pre-Columbian stone monuments are found in the Andes, not deep in rainforest terrain where stone construction is far more difficult to preserve. The nearest large civilizations known for monumental stonework, including the Inca, developed primarily in highland environments. The Amazon region, by contrast, is known for earthworks, ceramic cultures, and perishable architecture, rather than exposed stone sculpture. That makes the Harakbut face an archaeological outlier. The age of the carving remains uncertain. No direct dating method can be applied to solid rock carving without associated organic material. There are no inscriptions. No nearby settlement ruins have been definitively linked to the face. No ceramics have been securely dated at the immediate base of the cliff. Because of this, researchers rely largely on indirect clues. Some archaeologists suggest that the carving may date back to a pre-Inca jungle culture that has since been absorbed or erased. Others believe it could be a boundary marker or spiritual symbol created by a regional group that left few surviving material traces. A minority propose that the face may be a modified natural formation enhanced by human shaping rather than carved entirely from scratch. What complicates interpretation is the rainforest itself. Organic decay is rapid. Structures built from wood and plant fibers disappear within decades. Flooding, vegetation growth, and soil movement constantly reshape the terrain. A stone face carved into a cliff would be one of the few features capable of surviving for centuries without total erasure. The positioning of the face is not accidental. From the valley below, the face becomes visible only at certain times of day, when sunlight enters the jungle canopy at a low angle. For most of the day, it blends back into the cliff. This suggests the creator understood both the geography and light movement of the site. If the face served a ritual purpose, this selective visibility may have been intentional. It would appear as a presence rather than a permanent display, emerging briefly, then disappearing again into stone and shadow. There is no clear evidence that the face was meant to be climbed or accessed directly. No carved steps lead upward. No platforms exist at the base. This suggests it may have been designed to be viewed from a distance rather than approached closely. The expression of the face is neutral. It is neither aggressive nor clearly benevolent. The eyes are circular and deep. The mouth is straight. The nose is strong but not exaggerated. The overall emotion conveyed is watchfulness rather than threat. This neutrality is important. Many ancient guardian figures around the world emphasize fear through sharp teeth, large eyes, or animal features. The Harakbut face does not follow that pattern. It appears human, calm, and detached. This aligns with Harakbut oral descriptions of the face as a watcher rather than a protector or punisher. It is described as something that observes rather than intervenes. One of the biggest challenges in studying the face is access. The site is legally protected indigenous territory. Archaeological research requires permission, cooperation, and non-invasive methods. This limits the kinds of testing that can be performed. No drilling, no heavy excavation, and no permanent installations are allowed. This also protects the site from the destruction that has affected many remote archaeological locations. Looting, mining, and illegal logging have damaged vast portions of the Amazon. The face remains intact, largely because of its isolation and indigenous stewardship. From a geological perspective, the cliff itself is formed from durable sedimentary stone that fractures predictably under controlled force. This makes it suitable for carving but also means erosion shapes it in visible ways. The key difference between erosion and carving lies in repetition and symmetry. The face shows both. Weathering continues to act on the surface. Moss grows in protected recesses. Water streaks down the nose channel during rainfall. Small chips fall away during seasonal temperature shifts, yet the core structure remains stable. The absence of surrounding stone structures may point toward a cultural preference for minimal modification of the landscape. Rather than constructing an entire site, a single powerful image may have been deemed sufficient to mark significance. Unlike temple complexes, which require maintenance and social organization to function. A cliff carving remains, even when the society that created it fades. This may explain why the face still exists when all other traces of its creators may be gone. Some researchers suggest the carving could be linked to Amazonian earthwork cultures that constructed large geometric shapes now visible from the air. If so, the face may represent a highly localized counterpart to those larger landscape-scale expressions. Another possibility is that the face marks an ancient travel corridor. Rivers in this region served as highways long before modern roads. The cliff may have stood along a navigable route, with the face acting as a landmark for travelers moving through otherwise indistinct jungle scenery. If this is correct, the carving would have served not as a temple, but as a geographic signal, a fixed reference point, marking arrival, boundary, or transition between territories. The absence of written records means any interpretation remains tentative. What can be said with certainty is that the Harakbut face reflects intentional, human modification of stone at a scale not commonly seen in rainforest environments. Standing at the base of the cliff today, surrounded by dense vegetation and the constant sound of insects, the presence of the face feels quiet but persistent. It does not dominate the landscape. It blends into it. Only when you search for it does it reveal itself. This subtlety may be the most important clue. The face was not meant to be constantly visible. It was meant to exist as part of the forest rather than above it. Over generations, the Harakbut people continued to pass down stories of the face as a place of respect. No efforts were made to repaint it, rebuild it, or modify it further. It was left as it was found. In a region where nearly everything organic decays and disappears, this single stone face remains as one of the only lasting physical markers of ancient human presence that predates colonial history in this part of the Amazon. Unlike pyramids, temples, or cities, the giant carved face of Harakbut does not announce an empire. It does not proclaim kingship or conquest. It offers no inscriptions. It leaves no dates. The giant stone towers of Nalanda, India, on the flat plains of present-day Bihar, where fields stretch wide and rivers move slowly through the land, the remains of one of the greatest learning centers the ancient world ever produced lie quietly in brick and stone. From a distance, the ruins look like long rectangular mounds framed by scattered walls and broken stairways. But as you walk deeper into the site, the true scale becomes clearer. This is Nalanda, once the largest residential university complex of the ancient world, active for nearly 7 centuries. Nalanda was not a single building or a temple school. It was a planned academic city. At its height, it included monasteries, classrooms, lecture halls, temples, libraries, dormitories, gardens, water tanks, and towering brick structures that rose several stories high. Students and teachers lived here permanently. Learning was not a seasonal activity. It was a full-time civilization of study. As you enter the ruins today, the first thing you notice is repetition. Long rows of monastery blocks stretch in parallel lines. Each block contains dozens of identical rooms arranged around open courtyards. These small, stone and brick cells once housed thousands of students. Each room had a raised sleeping platform, a niche for lamps, and space for manuscripts. This was not symbolic architecture. It was functional housing built to support a massive learning population. Historical records describe Nalanda as home to more than 10,000 students and over 1,000 teachers at its peak. Scholars arrived here from all across Asia, from China, Korea, Tibet, Southeast Asia, Sri Lanka, and Central Asia. To reach Nalanda meant crossing mountains, deserts, and oceans. Those who arrived did not come for brief visits. They stayed for years. The scale of the ruins supports the historical accounts. The residential blocks alone cover a huge area. Each monastery rises 3 to 4 stories in height. Staircases connect multiple levels. Drainage systems run beneath floors. Wells and water tanks appear at regular intervals, showing that urban infrastructure was carefully embedded into the design. At the heart of the complex once stood massive lecture halls and temples. Their foundations are still visible today as broad platforms built from tightly fitted brick courses. Some of these structures were originally over 30 meters tall. These were the stone towers, remembered in later descriptions, not single monuments, but entire multi-story academic buildings. The most important subject taught at Nalanda was Buddhism, particularly Mahayana and later Vajrayana philosophy. But the curriculum extended far beyond religion. Students studied logic, grammar, medicine, astronomy, mathematics, metaphysics, and statecraft. This was not a monastery isolated from society. It was an intellectual hub that trained administrators, monks, physicians, and scholars who later served across Asia. Nalanda's fame spread largely through the writings of travelers. One of the most important eyewitnesses was the Chinese monk Xuanzang, who lived and studied at Nalanda in the 7th century. He described towering buildings, vast libraries, daily debates, and a disciplined academic environment, regulated by strict examination systems. Admission was not open to all. Students were tested at the gates by resident scholars before being allowed to enter. The description of the libraries is especially striking. Nalanda housed 3 main library buildings, collectively known as the Dharma Gunj, or Treasury of Truth. One of these buildings, according to tradition, rose 9 stories high. These towers stored thousands of palm leaf manuscripts covering every field of knowledge then known in the Buddhist world. These were not simple religious texts. They included medicine, mathematics, logic systems, and linguistic treatises. Walking through the ruins today, you see the empty foundations where these libraries once stood. Thick brick walls show signs of intense heat exposure, likely from the fires that eventually destroyed the complex. Burned brick surfaces still bear discoloration from that final catastrophe. The city-like organization of Nalanda becomes clearer the longer you walk. Residential monasteries line one axis, teaching temples line another. Open courtyards separate living and learning spaces. The entire site was oriented around both movement and separation: movement between classes and temples, separation for silence and study. Water management played a major role in daily life. Stone-lined tanks collected rainwater. Wells provided clean supply year-round. Channels carried wastewater away from residential areas. This infrastructure supported a population comparable to a modern university town. The teachers of Nalanda were not only monks, they were public intellectuals of their age. Debates were conducted openly in courtyards. Visiting scholars challenged resident masters. Texts were copied and translated continuously. Nalanda was one of the main centers through which Indian philosophy, medicine, and Buddhist doctrine spread into East Asia. Generations of translators trained here before carrying knowledge into China and Tibet. The form of Buddhism practiced across much of Asia today still bears the intellectual imprint of Nalanda's scholars. For nearly 700 years, the university functioned with royal support from multiple Indian dynasties. Endowments funded food, housing, and construction. Kings saw Nalanda not just as a religious center, but as a foundation of state stability through education. This long continuity ended abruptly in the 12th century. During the invasions of the eastern Ganges region by Turkic armies, Nalanda became a target. The monastic population offered no military resistance. The libraries were set on fire. Contemporary accounts describe manuscripts burning for months due to the sheer volume of texts stored in the towers. The destruction was so complete that institutional learning at Nalanda never recovered. After the attack, surviving monks scattered. The remaining population slowly abandoned the site. Without residents to maintain buildings, vegetation reclaimed the complex. Walls collapsed. Roofs fell inward. Over centuries, the once great university became a silent field of brick mounds. For a long time, even the memory of Nalanda blurred. Local villages reused bricks from the ruins as building material. Only faint legends remained of a place where knowledge once ruled. Systematic archaeological excavation began in the 19th century. As layers of soil were removed, the full plan of the university emerged. Monastery after monastery appeared in clean rows. Stairways, doorways, study cells, and courtyards were uncovered almost intact beneath the earth. What surprised archaeologists most was how standardized the living quarters were. Each student cell followed the same basic design. This suggests not casual growth, but long-term institutional planning. Nalanda was built to function as a permanent knowledge city. The scale also reshaped how historians understood ancient education. Before Nalanda's excavation, universities were often imagined as small temple schools. Nalanda proved that full urban-scale educational centers existed more than 1,000 years before medieval European universities. Standing today in the central axis of the ruins, you can trace the length of the campus by sight alone. Row after row of brick structures fade into the distance, The sense of order remains even in ruin. Paths still align, courtyards still open, stairs still climb to where upper floors once stood, birds nest in window openings that once framed students reading by lamplight. Grass covers lecture hall floors that once echoed with debate. The silence feels heavy, because the purpose of the place was once sound voices, arguments, recitation, instruction. Nalanda was not only a place of preservation, it was a place of creation. New philosophies were refined here, medical knowledge was expanded, logical systems were formalized. The sheer density of scholarship concentrated in one location for so long is unmatched in much of the ancient world. The giant stone towers remembered in later descriptions were not monuments to kings. They were monuments to study. They rose not to display power, but to store ideas. That alone makes Nalanda unique. What also sets Nalanda apart is that its fall did not come from gradual decline. It came from sudden violent rupture. A knowledge system built over centuries disappeared within a short span of years. Unlike cities that fade slowly, Nalanda was silenced almost at once. Yet its influence did not vanish. The students who studied there carried its intellectual structures far beyond India. Many of the philosophical schools active today in Tibet, China, Korea, and Japan still trace their doctrinal roots to Nalanda lineages. The megalith fortress of Sarmizegetusa, Romania, high in the forested mountains of western Romania, where mist drifts between ridgelines and long slopes, disappear into dense woodland. The ruins of an ancient capital lie scattered across a remote plateau. There are no wide roads leading here. No large modern towns nearby. The climb is slow, the air thinner, and the silence deep. This is Sarmizegetusa Regia, once the heart of the Dacian kingdom and one of the most unusual fortified cities in Iron Age Europe. At first glance, the site feels almost understated. Low stone walls trace broken lines across the terrain. Terraces step down the hillside in wide platforms. Trees grow where whole neighborhoods once stood. But as you walk deeper into the ruins, a pattern begins to emerge. This was not a random mountain settlement. It was a carefully planned center built with geometry, ritual, intent, and strategic control in mind. Sarmizegetusa Regia served as the political, military, and religious capital of the Dacians during the 1st century BCE and the early 1st century CE. The Dacians controlled much of what is now Romania, and they stood as one of the last major powers in Europe to resist the expanding Roman Empire. Their capital was not built on open plains like Roman cities. It was anchored in the mountains, hidden, defended by elevation and isolation. The approach to the site follows ancient stone-paved paths that climb through forest and rock. Some of these roads are still intact after more than 2,000 years. Their surfaces are worn smooth by countless footsteps. These roads once connected Sarmizegetusa to a network of surrounding fortresses that formed a defensive ring across the mountains. Once inside the main enclosure, the layout begins to reveal itself. The city was built on multiple artificial terraces carved into the mountain slope. These terraces were stabilized, with massive limestone walls assembled without mortar. The stones are fitted closely together, forming dry stone constructions of remarkable strength. The residential areas once occupied the lower terraces. Above them lay administrative and military zones. At the highest levels stood the sacred complexes, a group of structures unlike anything else in the ancient European world. Here, on a flat, elevated terrace, lie the famous stone circles of Sarmizegetusa. These are not fortification walls. They are not houses. They are ritual constructions built from andesite and limestone blocks, arranged into precise, circular, and rectangular patterns. Some consist of concentric rings of stone pillars. Others form long, curved alignments. One structure in particular resembles a massive, circular calendar laid out horizontally across the ground. The purpose of these stone circles remains one of the most debated aspects of the site. Archaeologists agree that this was the religious heart of the Dacian capital. Priests likely conducted rituals here tied to the sky, the seasons, and royal authority. The repeated use of circular geometry suggests cosmic symbolism, cycles, time, and celestial motion made visible in stone. One of the largest structures, often called the Great Circular Sanctuary, consists of two concentric stone rings with a rectangular alignment at its center. The outer ring is made of tall stone pillars set at regular intervals. The inner ring features shorter blocks arranged in a similar pattern. The precision of spacing is striking. This was not a rough construction. It was calculated and deliberate. Some researchers have proposed that this arrangement may have served as a solar calendar, tracking solstices and equinoxes through shadow alignment. Others suggest that it functioned as a ceremonial gathering space where elite rituals took place. There is also the possibility that it served multiple purposes over time. What makes interpretation difficult is the absence of written records from the Dacians themselves. Almost everything we know about them comes from Roman authors, who viewed them as enemies. The physical remains at Sarmizegetusa give clues, but not instructions. Surrounding the sanctuaries are traces of wooden buildings that once stood on stone foundations. These structures likely served as priestly residences, storage halls for ritual objects, and administrative rooms supporting the religious complex. Very little of the wood survives. Only post holes and floor outlines remain. The entire sacred area is positioned with clear awareness of the surrounding landscape. From the highest terrace, wide views open toward distant mountains. Sunrise and sunset play directly across the stone alignments. Light enters the complex in controlled ways throughout the day. Below, the sanctuaries, the military zones, reveal a different type of planning. Defensive walls follow the natural contours of the mountain. Towers once stood at key sightlines. Narrow gateways controlled movement between terraces. Attackers would have been forced to climb through exposed approaches, while defenders held the high ground. One of the most sophisticated features of Sarmizegetusa is its water system. Stone pipes were carved from andesite blocks, drilled through their centers to form a continuous water channel. These pipes carried fresh mountain water directly into the fortress from distant springs. The technology required to drill long, straight holes through hard volcanic stone without metal drilling machinery remains impressive even by modern standards. This water system supplied drinking water to the population during both peace and siege. It also fed ritual basins near the sanctuaries. The separation of sacred and practical water usage suggests that the Dacians maintained a complex relationship between daily life and religious practice. At its peak, Sarmizegetusa Regia was not a small hilltop camp. It was a full urban center with artisans, soldiers, administrators, farmers, priests, and royal authority all concentrated within the mountain stronghold. Metalworking workshops have been discovered, along with coin molds, weapons, tools, and imported luxury goods. This shows that the city was not isolated. It was connected to long-distance trade, networks reaching into the Roman world, the Greek cities along the Black Sea, and deep into Central Europe. The Dacians were not operating at the edge of civilization. They were part of it. The fall of Sarmizegetusa came during the Dacian wars against Rome at the beginning of the 2nd century CE. The Roman Emperor Trajan launched 2 massive military campaigns against the Dacians. After fierce resistance, Roman legions breached the mountain defenses. In the final stages of the siege, the Romans cut the water supply of the fortress by destroying the stone pipelines. Without water, resistance collapsed. The city was captured, looted, and partially destroyed. The Dacian king Decebalus fled and later took his own life, rather than be paraded in Rome. After the conquest, the Romans dismantled much of the fortress to prevent future rebellion. They built a new Roman city called Ulpia Traiana Sarmizegetusa in the lowlands, shifting the political center away from the mountains. The old capital was gradually abandoned. Over centuries, forest grew over the ruins. Wooden structures rotted away. Stone walls collapsed outward. Soil filled terraces. The sacred circles were buried beneath vegetation. The once defiant mountain city disappeared into the trees. Systematic archaeological exploration began in the 20th century. As layers of forest were cleared, the geometry of the site re-emerged. The stone circles were revealed again. The water pipes were uncovered. The terraces became readable as an organized urban system rather than random ruins. What surprised archaeologists most was how advanced and intentional the layout proved to be. This was not a primitive fortress. It was a carefully structured capital blending military defense, urban planning, and sacred geometry in a way rarely seen north of the Mediterranean world at that time. Standing today inside the circular sanctuary as wind moves through the stone pillars, the experience feels strangely detached from ordinary ruins. There are no inscriptions to read, no statues to interpret, no written doctrine carved into the walls. Only geometry, spacing, and alignment remain to communicate meaning. The silence is part of the message. The megalith fortress of Sarmizegetusa remains one of the few ancient European capitals where political power and sacred architecture were fused so tightly into the same terrain. The mountain was not only a defense, it was part of the cosmology of the city itself. Here, leadership did not sit in open plazas or marble forums. It occupied elevated platforms framed by sky and stone. Even now, the purpose of the great circles is not fully understood. They resist simple explanations. They do not match known Greek, Roman, or Celtic ritual formats exactly. They belong to a worldview that vanished almost completely with the fall of the Dacian kingdom. Sarmizegetusa Regia stands today as a rare window into that lost world. A capital, built in forest and stone. A religious center shaped through geometry instead of monuments. A fortress that drew its power as much from ritual alignment as from walls and weapons. The megalith fortress of Sarmizegetusa does not overwhelm with height or mass. It challenges through design and intention. It tells us that long before Rome absorbed this land, a mountain civilization had already shaped it according to its own understanding of power, nature, and the sky. The Cyclopean platform of Baal Shamin, Syria, in the heart of the Syrian desert, where stone ruins rise from open sand and ancient caravan routes once crossed between empires, there stood a small but important temple dedicated to a sky god. For centuries, travelers saw only its Roman-era columns and sculpted capitals, but beneath that familiar classical structure lay something older, heavier, and far less understood, a massive stone platform built from enormous blocks, whose origin remains uncertain. This place is known as the Temple of Baal Shamin, once part of the great desert city of Palmyra, and its lowest foundation tells a story that does not fully match the elegant temple that once stood above it. Baal Shamin was a local Semitic sky god associated with rain, storms, and fertility. Long before Roman legions reached this desert, his worship was already established among caravan traders and oasis communities. When Palmyra rose to prominence as a powerful trade hub between the Roman world and the East, older religious traditions were not erased. They were absorbed, reshaped, and sometimes rebuilt in stone. The visible temple that stood at Baal Shamin until its destruction in the 21st century dated largely to the Roman period, around the 1st and 2nd centuries CE. It followed classical design, Corinthian columns, carved friezes, and proportional symmetry. To casual observers, it looked like a standard Roman provincial sanctuary, but archaeologists, studying the temple more closely, noticed something unusual at its base. The lower platform was not Roman in character at all. Instead of neatly squared blocks of manageable size, the lowest foundation stones were Cyclopean immense, irregularly shaped blocks, fitted together with tight seams. Some of these stones weighed many tens of tons. Their surfaces were smoothed only where they touched neighboring blocks. The rest was left rough. This style sharply contrasts with Roman masonry, which favored uniform blocks, standardized sizes, and regular courses. The Roman builders had not created this platform. They had reused it, standing beside the foundations when the temple was still intact. The difference was immediately visible. Above the platform rose orderly Roman columns built from segmented drums. Below them sat massive monoliths that looked far older, far cruder, and far more difficult to move. The temple seemed to sit on an architectural time fracture, a refined Roman structure placed directly on top of something from a different tradition entirely. The platform stones were not merely large, they were unbelievably heavy for a desert environment with no nearby quarries of matching scale. Transporting such blocks would have required enormous labor, specialized hauling techniques, and advanced planning. And yet, no clear construction records exist explaining how or when these stones were first placed. What archaeologists could determine was that the platform predates the Roman temple by centuries, possibly by over 1,000 years. Some researchers link it to earlier Palmyrene religious structures. Others suggest it could be part of a much older sacred complex long forgotten by written history. The Romans were known for a very specific habit. When they encountered an older sacred site, they often built directly on top of it. This allowed them to preserve local religious importance while converting it into a form recognizable within Roman imperial culture. Baal Shamin appears to follow that pattern, but the scale of the reused platform is far larger than most typical pre-Roman foundations. Walking across the lower stones in the past, before modern destruction, one could feel how uneven the joints were, and yet how stable the structure remained. The blocks locked into each other through weight and geometry rather than mortar. The Romans had simply leveled the top and placed their columned sanctuary above it. This reuse tells us something important. Whatever structure stood here originally was already old, heavy, and significant enough that even the Roman engineers chose not to dismantle it. They adapted to it. The placement of Baal Shamin's temple within Palmyra also reveals intent. It stood not at the center of the Great Colonnade, but slightly apart, near earlier sections of the city. This location suggests continuity of ritual space reaching back to pre-Roman Palmyra, when caravan traders worshipped desert gods tied to sky, rain, and survival. Palmyra itself was never merely a Roman city. It was a hybrid civilization. Arab, Aramaean, Greek, and Roman influences blended into one of the wealthiest trade cities of the ancient world. Merchants passing through brought silk from the east, glass from the Mediterranean, spices from Arabia, and precious metals from distant lands. In such a melting pot, religious traditions layered rather than replaced one another. The Cyclopean platform beneath Baal Shamin reflects that deep layering. It belongs to a phase of Palmyra that predates written architectural history for the region, a time when desert communities invested enormous effort into creating permanent, sacred foundations tied to survival itself. Rain in this region was life. A sky god mattered. The size of the stones used in the platform may reflect that importance. This was not a minor roadside shrine. It was a place meant to endure beyond generations. In Roman times, the sanctuary was renovated and formalized. Statues were added. Columns were erected. Carved decorations framed the entrance. But the foundation remained untouched, a buried witness to a belief system older than empire. Then came destruction again, in a different form. In the 21st century, during the Syrian civil war, the visible Roman temple of Baal Shaman was deliberately destroyed. Explosives reduced the upper structure to rubble. What remained after that event was not elegant classical architecture, but the ancient platform beneath it, the Cyclopean base, that had survived multiple civilizations. In a tragic way, the destruction revealed the age difference even more clearly than archaeology alone ever could. The Roman temple vanished in seconds. The older foundation remained. Even heavily damaged, those massive stones did not disintegrate the way the column structure did. Their scale and placement absorbed shock differently. The earlier builders had worked entirely in weight and mass, not in slender form and ornament. This contrast between the two building traditions, Roman refinement above, primordial monumentality below, is what makes Baal Shamin unique among Palmyra's ruins. It is not just a temple site, it is a visible junction between two completely different architectural philosophies. Above, balance. Proportion, decoration. Below, permanence, mass, endurance. As archaeologists mapped the base in detail before the destruction, they noted that some of the Cyclopean blocks aligned with directions tied to prevailing winds and solar movement, suggesting that the platform may have held astronomical or climate-related significance long before the Roman redesign. This would make sense for a sky deity sanctuary tied to rain and seasonal cycles. Unfortunately, the political instability of the region has halted long-term deep excavation at the site. Much of what lies beneath the Cyclopean platform remains untouched. Its original layout, associated chambers, or connected structures are still unknown. We do not know what stood here before the Roman temple. We only know that it was large enough that even an empire chose not to remove it. Standing before the ruins today in the condition they now exist, the absence of the upper temple makes the platform feel even more isolated and ancient. Without columns and carvings to frame it, the foundation appears raw, exposed, and out of place in time. It no longer looks like part of a classical ruin. It looks like something older, struggling to surface through history. The Cyclopean platform of Baal Shamin reminds us that ancient cities are not single-layered. They are stacked memories. Empires rise on older civilizations. Temples rise on forgotten sanctuaries. Polished architecture rises on foundations that no one alive remembers shaping. In Palmyra, that layering is unusually visible. The Roman world left behind beauty and symmetry. The unknown builders beneath left behind stones so heavy that even time bends around it slowly. And in that quiet difference between what was lost and what still remains, the oldest builders of Baal Shamin continue to speak not through inscriptions or statues, but through mass, pressure, and unbroken stone. The megalithic fortress of Marcahuasi, Peru. High above the central Peruvian highlands, on a wind-swept plateau that rises more than 13,000 feet above sea level. A strange stone landscape stretches across the horizon. From a distance, it looks like a natural field of eroded rock towers. But as you walk deeper between the formations, something changes. Faces appear in the stone, animals take shape and profile, human figures seem to emerge from the ridge itself. This place is known as Markawasi, and it remains one of the most visually puzzling stone landscapes in South America. Reaching Markawasi is not easy. A long climb winds upward from the nearest villages through thin air and shifting weather. Clouds roll in without warning. Winds remain constant. The plateau itself is broad and relatively flat, with stone formations rising abruptly like frozen waves across the surface. At first, many of the shapes appear accidental. Wind and rain are powerful sculptors at this altitude. Over thousands of years, they can carve sharp edges, hollow faces, and tall columns from limestone and granite. But at Markawasi, the repeated appearance of recognizable figures challenges that simple explanation. As you move along the ridge, you begin to notice patterns that feel intentional. A lion-like profile with a defined eye socket and jaw, a condor shape with wings suggested by layered stone, a human face with forehead, nose, lips, and chin clearly separated. These forms do not appear randomly clustered. They are spread across the plateau as if arranged along a long, open gallery. Local communities have known about these formations for centuries. To them, the shapes are not illusions. They are guardians, ancestral figures, and symbolic beings embedded into the mountain. Some are associated with animals important to Andean cosmology. Others are linked to stories of ancient watchers turned into stone. Modern interest in Markawasi surged in the mid-20th century, when Peruvian researchers documented dozens of recognizable shapes across the plateau and proposed that at least some of them were intentionally modified by human hands. Since then, debate has continued without resolution. The central question remains simple but difficult. How much of Markawasi is natural erosion, and how much is deliberate carving? Geologically, the plateau is made primarily of limestone that fractures into large blocks under pressure. Rainwater seeps into cracks, freezes at night, and expands. Over time, this process can create vertical towers, rounded cavities, and balanced stone forms. In many parts of the world, this produces landscapes that resemble sculpture without any human input, but Markawasi pushes the limits of coincidence. Some faces exhibit bilateral symmetry. Certain eye sockets appear evenly aligned. Mouth lines cut cleanly across surfaces, rather than following random fractures. These features are rare in purely erosional landscapes. Supporters of intentional carving argue that ancient Andean cultures were capable of large-scale stone modification long before the rise of the Inca. Stone tools, abrasion methods, and controlled fracturing could have gradually refined natural shapes into recognizable figures over generations. Skeptics counter that humans tend to see faces where none were intended, a psychological effect known as pareidolia. According to this view, Markawasi is a natural stone forest that the human brain simply interprets symbolically. The truth likely lies somewhere between these extremes. Many of the core formations are almost certainly natural, but some may have been subtly enhanced by ancient hands. An eye deepened here, a jawline sharpened there just enough to turn suggestion into identity. What strengthens the mystery is the location of Markawasi itself. This is not a place suited for permanent, large-scale settlement. There is no consistent water supply on the plateau. Agriculture is extremely limited. The climate is harsh, with freezing nights even in dry seasons. This suggests that Markawasi was not a residential city in the usual sense. It may have been something else entirely. Some archaeologists believe the plateau served as a ceremonial observation site. From its edge, wide views stretch across the surrounding valleys. Sunrise and sunset create dramatic shadows that dramatically alter the appearance of the stone figures throughout the day. At certain moments, faces appear, suddenly, and then vanish again as light shifts. A profile visible in the morning disappears by afternoon. A shape that looks meaningless in full sun becomes striking under low-angle light. This interaction between stone and sky may have been central to the site's purpose. There is also strong tradition of astronomical observation in Andean cultures. High-altitude sites were often chosen for tracking solstices, equinoxes, and seasonal star movements. From Markawasi, the night sky is exceptionally clear. Even today, it offers a wide, uninterrupted view of celestial motion. Some theories propose that the animal and human figures were arranged along sightlines tied to key solar or stellar events. While no precise alignment system has been universally accepted, the open layout and wide horizon make this possibility difficult to dismiss. Another unusual aspect of Markawasi is the absence of typical archaeological debris. There are few permanent foundations, no major residential blocks, no large burial grounds directly on the plateau. This sets it apart from settled ceremonial centers like those of the Inca. Instead, Markawasi feels transitional, a place meant to be visited rather than inhabited. Some visitors report a psychological intensity at the site. The combination of altitude, silence, vast sky, and looming stone figures creates a powerful sensory experience. Whether this is purely environmental or culturally programmed through expectation is impossible to test, but the effect is consistent across many accounts. Many of the most famous figures on the plateau have been given modern names based on what they resemble: the lion, the human face, the tortoise, the camel, the condor. These labels are recent and not necessarily tied to ancient meanings. The original symbolic identities, if any existed, are lost. What we do know is that pre-Inca cultures across the Andean region invested enormous effort into shaping stone landscapes. From carved hillsides to modified boulders to reshaped ridges, stone was not only a building material but a medium of expression. Markawasi fits into that wider Andean tradition of interacting with natural forms rather than replacing them. Instead of constructing massive freestanding monuments, ancient peoples often altered what already existed, blending human intention with natural structure. If Markawasi was modified in this way, then it represents one of the largest examples of landscape-scale symbolic carving in the region. Not a single sculpture, but an entire mountain ridge treated as a symbolic surface. The term megalithic fortress is sometimes applied to Markawasi due to the imposing nature of its stone towers and the elevated defensive position the plateau offers. But there is little evidence that it functioned as a military installation. No continuous defensive walls exist. No controlled gateways or large storage areas have been identified. The plateau feels open, not fortressed. If people gathered here, they likely came for ritual, seasonal observation, or symbolic pilgrimage, rather than for protection. Another persistent mystery involves the apparent orientation of some figures toward distant mountain peaks. In Andean belief, mountains were living ancestors known as apis. Aligning stone figures toward specific peaks would have carried spiritual meaning rather than practical purpose. Again, no single alignment map has been conclusively proven, but the repeated orientation toward prominent horizons suggests intentional placement rather than random accident. Markawasi today remains largely unexcavated in a traditional archaeological sense. There are few controlled digs. Much of what we know comes from surface observation rather than stratified study. This is mainly due to the absence of buried architecture and the difficulty of applying conventional excavation methods to exposed rock forms. Preservation is also a concern. Tourism has increased over recent decades. Visitors climb onto stone figures. Some carvings have suffered surface damage. Without formal protection measures, gradual erosion is now being accelerated by human contact. The plateau remains active in local cultural memory. Ritual visits still occur on certain dates. Offerings appear in sheltered stone niches. The mountain is not treated as an abandoned relic, but as a living presence within the landscape. This continuity of meaning is important. It reminds us that not all ancient sites are locked in the past. Some continue to function symbolically long after their original creators are gone. The megalithic fortress of Markawasi does not present us with clear records, inscriptions, or dates. It offers something different, a conversation between natural geology and possible human intention that has never been fully separated. Some of what we see is surely the work of wind, rain, and time, but some of it continues to resist explanation through erosion alone. And in that unresolved space between nature and culture, Markawasi continues to challenge how we recognize ancient human presence in the landscape. It may not be a city, it may not be a temple, it may not be a fortress in the strict sense, but it is unmistakably a place where stone, sky, and human perception intersect in a way that has endured for unknown centuries. The megalithic fortress of Markawasi remains not as a solved puzzle, but as an open stone question carved across a mountain ridge. The giant stone enclosure of Musawarat, Sudan. Far from the main course of the Nile, Deep within the rocky desert plains of eastern Sudan, there is a vast stone complex whose purpose still resists simple explanation. No tall pyramids stand here, no great columns rise above the sand. Instead, the site spreads outward in looping walls, courtyards, ramps, and corridors that seem to fold around themselves in deliberate confusion. This place is known as Musawarat es-Sufra, and at its center lies one of the most unusual monumental structures in the ancient world, the Great Enclosure. From the ground, Musawarat does not announce itself with dramatic height. Its power comes from scale and complexity. The enclosure covers several hectares. Its walls coil into one another. Passageways bend and double back. Platforms connect terraces at multiple levels. Nothing here follows the straight, symmetrical layouts seen at Egyptian temples or Roman cities. Instead, the architecture seems to have grown outward like a stone organism. The site dates primarily to the period of the ancient kingdom of Kush, roughly between the 3rd century BCE and the 4th century CE. This was a time when Nubian civilization controlled long stretches of the Nile and maintained its own identity alongside and sometimes in opposition to Egypt and Rome. Unlike the royal cities of Meroe or Napata, Musawarat was not a capital. It held no palace and no necropolis of kings. Instead, it was a place visited, used, and then left behind without clear explanation. This alone sets it apart. The Great Enclosure is the heart of the mystery. Its stone walls rise in stacked tiers. Courtyards open into each other without obvious hierarchy. Some passageways lead abruptly to dead ends. Others connect to elevated platforms with wide ramps. From above, the layout looks almost chaotic. From within, it feels intentional, but unreadable. There is no clear front of the complex, no single ceremonial axis, no processional entrance in the traditional sense. Visitors entering from different directions would experience the enclosure in completely different ways. This lack of straightforward orientation is one of the strongest clues that Musawarat was not built as a conventional temple or city. What gives the site its most distinctive identity are the elephants. Throughout the complex, carved reliefs of elephants appear on stone blocks and walls. Some are shown calmly standing. Others seem to be in motion. A few appear in stylized or symbolic poses. These are not decorative flourishes. They are repeated motifs across the site. In Nubian culture, elephants were not common everyday animals. They were powerful, rare, and dangerous. Their presence in stone suggests ritual importance rather than simple observation. Some scholars believe that Musawarat served as a center for elephant-related rituals, possibly connected to royal power, warfare, or long-distance trade. There is historical evidence that Nubian kingdoms captured and trained war elephants for use in military campaigns and for export to other powers, including Hellenistic and Roman forces. Musawarat's remote location, away from dense urban centers, could have made it suitable for handling such animals. However, the architecture does not resemble stables or military training grounds. The corridors are too narrow in places. The platforms are too elevated. The internal circulation patterns are too complex for large animal movement at scale. This contradiction lies at the center of Musawarat's identity crisis. Everything hints at elephants, yet nothing fully accommodates them. Another theory suggests that Musawarat functioned primarily as a pilgrimage center. The isolation of the site supports this. It stands away from major settlements, routes, and farmland. People likely traveled here intentionally rather than passing through by accident. Pilgrimage centers often display unusual layouts meant to disorient visitors and separate everyday movement from ritual procession. The looping corridors and layered courtyards of the Great Enclosure fit well with this possibility. Movement through the site would have felt like a controlled journey rather than a simple walk. If this interpretation is correct, then the elephant imagery may represent a deity, a totemic ancestor, or a symbolic force, rather than an actual animal used on site. To the east of the Great Enclosure stands the Lion Temple, a smaller but more conventional structure dedicated to the god Apedimak, a lion-headed warrior deity unique to the Nubian world. Its presence confirms that Musawarat had a strong religious role, but the style and organization of the Lion Temple differ sharply from the enclosure itself. The Lion Temple follows recognizable ceremonial logic. The Great Enclosure does not. Water management adds another layer to the mystery. Despite its desert location, Musawarat has an extensive system of reservoirs and stone basins designed to collect rainwater. These are not small cisterns. They are large engineered features capable of sustaining significant activity for extended periods. This suggests that when Musawarat was active, large numbers of people gathered here at certain times of the year. The site was not a permanent settlement, but it was not a minor shrine either. It sat somewhere between festival ground, ritual center, and symbolic landscape. What Musawarat lacks is just as important as what it contains. There are no residential quarters typical of cities, no markets, no workshops on large scale, no elite tombs, no administrative buildings. All the architecture points inward toward movement, gathering, and passage, rather than outward toward governance or daily life. This inward focus is rare in ancient monumental design. Most ancient complexes were meant to be seen from outside. Musawarat feels designed to be experienced from within. Another strange feature is the repeated rebuilding and modification of the enclosure across generations. Walls were added, reshaped, and partially dismantled. Platforms were extended, corridors were narrowed or widened. There was no fixed master plan completed in one phase. The site evolved organically over centuries. This kind of continuous architectural editing usually reflects changing ritual needs rather than political agendas. Kings tend to impose final monuments. Priestly traditions tend to accumulate layers. No major inscriptions survive to explain these changes. Very few texts mention Musawarat directly. It exists almost entirely as a physical problem, without a written solution. Standing within the great enclosure today, the scale becomes more apparent with every turn. Walls rise above head height in many areas. Narrow passages suddenly open into wide courts. Ramps carry you upward without clear indication of destination. Orientation becomes difficult. You begin to rely less on sight and more on memory of movement. This disorientation could be intentional. Ritual architecture in many ancient cultures uses confusion as a tool, separating the participant from the ordinary world and forcing attention inward. Musawarat seems to embody this principle at architectural scale. The construction techniques themselves reflect high skill. Large sandstone blocks were cut, placed, and stacked without mortar. Corners remain tight. Platforms remain level even after centuries of erosion. Despite the apparent chaos of layout, the engineering remains precise. Musawarat declined gradually. Unlike cities destroyed in war, there is no clear destruction layer here. The site simply lost its role. Activity slowed. Maintenance ended. Sand moved in. Walls collapsed selectively. The desert reclaimed the corridors. By the time modern archaeology arrived, Musawarat stood as a silent maze without purpose. Even today, scholars disagree on what the site truly was. Elephant sanctuary, pilgrimage center, symbolic landscape, ritual training ground, seasonal festival complex. No single theory explains all features without leaving major gaps. What is certain is that Musawarat es-Sufra does not behave like a normal ancient site. It is too large to be incidental, too complex to be accidental, too isolated to be urban, too engineered to be purely symbolic. It occupies a category of its own. The giant stone enclosure of Musawarat stands today as one of the few ancient constructions where architecture itself becomes the primary mystery. We can measure its walls. We can map its corridors. We can analyze its stonework. But its purpose remains stubbornly out of reach, and perhaps that is exactly how it was meant to be. The Forgotten Step Pyramid of Sayla, Egypt. On the western edge of Egypt's Fayum region, where desert hills rise gently from cultivated farmland, a small and often overlooked pyramid stands alone on a rocky ridge. It is nowhere near the famous necropolises of Giza or Saqqara. There are no surrounding tombs, no grand causeways, no temples, and no inscriptions to guide interpretation. This isolated monument is known today as the Sayla Pyramid, and it remains one of the most puzzling pyramids ever built in ancient Egypt. From a distance, the Sayla Pyramid does not immediately look like a pyramid at all. Its stones are broken. Its steps are partially collapsed. Centuries of erosion have softened its edges. But when you walk closer and take in its geometry, the structure becomes clear. It is a step pyramid, a tiered form rising upward in receding levels, like a simplified ancestor to the grand pyramids that would follow elsewhere. What makes Sayla unusual is not only its isolation, but what it does not contain. There is no burial chamber, no sarcophagus, no internal passageway, no funerary shaft. In every technical sense, Sela is not a tomb, and yet, it was. Built in the form of one of the most sacred funerary structures in Egyptian civilization, the pyramid is generally dated to the early 4th dynasty, during the reign of Sneferu, the father of Khufu, builder of the Great Pyramid. This was a time of intense architectural experimentation. Sneferu oversaw the construction of multiple pyramids, including the Mihdam Pyramid, the Bent Pyramid, and the Red Pyramid. Egypt was perfecting the science of true pyramid construction. But Sela does not fit neatly into this sequence. It is far smaller than royal pyramids. It stands alone, and it lacks the essential feature that defines a royal pyramid: a burial. The Sela pyramid stands approximately 6 to 7 meters tall in its current ruined state, though it may once have reached around 10 meters in height. It consists of a core built from rough limestone blocks arranged in step-like layers, originally coated with finer casing stones that have long since been stripped away or fallen. There is no visible entrance, no descending corridor, no internal architecture hidden beneath the rubble. Excavations have confirmed that the structure is solid all the way through. This immediately raises the core question: why build a pyramid that was never meant to hold a body? Sela is not entirely unique. It belongs to a small and mysterious group known as the Provincial Step Pyramids, a series of small pyramids scattered across Middle and Upper Egypt. Similar structures exist at sites such as Edfu, Elephantine, Zayet el Maitin, and Sinki. All of them share several traits. All are small, all are isolated, all lack burial chambers, all appear to date to the same early Old Kingdom period. This suggests that Sela was part of a coordinated state program rather than an individual local project. The prevailing theory is that these pyramids were not tombs at all, but symbolic monuments built to assert royal presence across the landscape. At a time when Egypt was unifying under strong, centralized rule, the king's authority may have been projected into distant regions through the construction of small pyramid monuments. In this interpretation, the Sela pyramid was not meant to be entered. It was meant to be seen. From its ridge, it commands wide views across the Fayum Basin. The location is not random. It sits at a boundary between desert routes and agricultural land. Travelers moving between regions would have seen it rising above the low hills, a visible marker of royal power embedded into the land itself. But even this explanation does not settle the matter completely. If Sela was purely symbolic, why choose the pyramid form rather than a stela, fortress, or shrine? Why replicate the most sacred royal funerary shape for a structure never intended for burial? One answer may lie in the deeper symbolic meaning of pyramids in early Egyptian thought. At this early stage, pyramids were not yet standardized tombs. They were cosmological symbols representing the primeval mound, the place where creation itself began. A solid pyramid, without chambers, could have functioned as a cosmic marker rather than a tomb. In this sense, Sela may have been less about death and more about divine order. Another theory suggests that Sela and its sister pyramids marked pilgrimage routes or administrative centers tied to early provincial governance. The pyramid would anchor royal ritual activities in a region otherwise far from the great capitals. Interestingly, evidence of associated buildings at Sela is extremely limited. No surrounding town has been conclusively identified. No priestly residences, no storage facilities, no ritual enclosure walls. This again suggests that Sela was not a functioning temple complex in the usual sense. It was a monument in isolation. Excavations around the pyramid have revealed fragments of limestone casing, confirming that the pyramid was once smooth and sharply defined, not the rough-stepped ruin we see today. Its original appearance would have been bright white under the sun, visible for long distances across the plateau. Over time, the casing was stripped away, likely reused in later construction projects nearby. This fate befell many Egyptian stone monuments once state protection faded. Sela's decline was quiet. Unlike pyramids that were looted or forcibly entered, Sela had nothing to loot in the first place. Its disappearance came through neglect, rather than destruction. Wind eroded it. Stones slid. Farmers and travelers removed blocks for practical reuse. By the time modern archaeology reached the site, only the core remained. What is particularly strange about Sela is how completely it lacks inscriptions. There is no surviving dedication to a king, no carving naming a divine patron, no reliefs showing ritual scenes, silence in stone. This absence makes Sela very different from most Egyptian monuments, which are usually saturated with text and symbolic imagery. It is raw architecture without explanation. Some scholars have suggested that Sela may have served as part of an early religious network linked to solar worship. The pyramid form itself is strongly tied to solar symbolism, and the orientation of some provincial pyramids suggests possible alignment with key solar directions. However, due to the ruined condition of Sela, precise alignment measurements remain uncertain. Others have proposed that the pyramid represents an unfinished experiment, a prototype abandoned early in construction when royal priorities shifted elsewhere. But this theory is weakened by the existence of multiple similar step pyramids built at the same time across different regions. It seems unlikely that all of them were abandoned experiments. Sela may instead represent a forgotten architectural category altogether. Monuments built not for the dead, not for daily worship, not for defense, but for territorial symbolism during a formative political phase of the Egyptian state. In that sense, Sela becomes a map marker carved in stone. Standing beside it today, the silence is striking. No crowds, no grand processional paths, no interpretive panels explaining its purpose. Just a small pyramid on a ridge, overlooking farmland and desert in equal measure. The structure does not command attention in the way Giza does. It does not overwhelm. It does not announce itself loudly. And yet, its existence unsettles simple categories. It is a pyramid that is not a tomb, a royal form with no royal burial, a monument with no message. The forgotten step pyramid of Sela forces us to confront how much of ancient Egypt's earliest architecture remains archaeologically visible but historically mute. We see the stones, we trace the plan, we date the layers, but the intention behind it remains sealed, not by sand, but by the absence of record. Sela stands today as a boundary object between certainty and speculation. It is proof that even in a civilization famous for documenting itself in obsessive detail, some parts of the story were left unspoken, and in that quiet gap between form and function, the Sela pyramid continues to exist not as a solved monument, but as a question carefully stacked in stone. The hidden stone road of Malta. On the small Mediterranean islands of Malta, where limestone cliffs meet deep blue water and prehistoric temples stand among modern towns, there exists a form of ancient infrastructure that continues to resist simple explanation. Carved directly into the solid bedrock, hundreds of parallel grooves crisscross hills, valleys, and coastlines. They run straight, curve sharply, intersect, climb slopes, and sometimes vanish abruptly at the edge of cliffs. These features are known today as the Malta Cart Ruts, and together they form what appears to be a hidden, stone road system cut into the island itself. At first glance, a single pair of ruts looks simple. Two shallow channels run parallel, spaced just over a meter apart. The grooves are smooth, rounded, and consistent in width. In many places, they are worn far deeper than a person's footstep could ever create. Some descend more than half a meter into the rock. Viewed alone, one pair can be dismissed as erosion or isolated transport marks. But Malta does not have one or two such examples. It has hundreds. At sites such as Misra Gar il Kabir, often called Clapham Junction, the ruts multiply into chaotic networks. Dozens of parallel lines overlap, split, merge, and cross each other. Some form tight curves. Others climb steep inclines that would challenge even modern vehicles. A few pairs run directly into the sea, disappearing beneath the waves. There are no surviving vehicles associated with these tracks, no identifiable roads built above them, no written records that explain their purpose, just stone carved into stone. The ruts appear across both Malta and Gozo, often near ancient temple sites, but also far from any known settlement. Their distribution suggests a system rather than isolated usage. This was not one road, it was many. The most common spacing between the parallel grooves is around 1.4 meters. This consistency has led many researchers to suggest that the ruts were created by wheeled vehicles of some kind. But this assumption immediately raises new problems. The limestone of Malta is relatively soft when freshly exposed, but it hardens over time. Cutting deep, consistent wheel grooves directly into solid rock would require not just repeated passage, but extraordinary pressure and weight. Light wooden carts would not be enough. Even heavy stone-laden vehicles would struggle to produce such uniform channels without crushing their own wheels in the process. And yet, across large areas, the ruts are cut far deeper than natural surface scratches. Some archaeologists have suggested that the ruts were formed not by wheeled carts at all, but by sledges dragged along prepared stone corridors. In this model, heavy loads of stone or goods would have been pulled directly across the rock surface, gradually wearing paired grooves into the limestone through centuries of repeated use. This theory addresses the absence of wheel remains but does not explain the precision of parallel spacing across unrelated sites. It also does not explain how such sledges would navigate steep slopes and sharp turns without disasters. Another explanation points to quarrying activity. Malta's prehistoric builders extracted enormous quantities of stone to build the island's megalithic temples, including sites like Ager Kiyim, Nadra, and Tarxian. Transporting massive stone blocks across long distances would have required prepared pathways. In this view, the cart ruts represent stone hauling routes, connecting quarries to temple sites. The repeated dragging of heavy blocks carved deep channels into the limestone over generations. But this explanation also faces problems. Many ruts do not lead to any known quarries. Others do not connect to temples. Some terminate in open countryside with no apparent destination. And some descend directly into the sea, where no transport route would logically end. The age of the ruts is equally difficult to establish. Because they are carved into exposed bedrock, there is no stratified layer beneath them that can be reliably dated. Some ruts cut across natural fissures that appear very old. Others are overlain by soil that dates to later periods. This suggests that rut carving may have occurred over a long span of time, rather than in one single era. Some researchers propose that the ruts date to Malta's prehistoric temple period, between roughly 3,600 and 2,500 BCE. If true, this would make the system one of the oldest known transport networks in Europe. Others argue for a later Bronze Age, or even early Iron Age origin. There is also the Roman possibility. Romans built extensive road systems throughout their empire. However, Roman roads in Malta are known, and they do not resemble these ruts. Roman roads were built up with layered surfaces, not cut down into bedrock as twin grooves. The ruts do not match medieval cart tracks either. Medieval roads left wear patterns on soil and gravel, not deep gouges in solid limestone. This places the ruts in an uncomfortable chronological gap too engineered to be natural, too strange to match known historical road systems. The most unsettling aspect is their behavior at cliffs. At several coastal sites, pairs of ruts run cleanly toward the sea and then vanish over vertical drops. There is no turning point, no stop platform, no sign of loading ramps. The ruts simply continue into open water. This has led to speculation that the coastline may once have extended farther out, and that rising sea levels drowned the continuation of the network. If true, the ruts could be significantly older than previously assumed, dating to a time when sea levels were much lower than today. But even this explanation raises new questions. If the ruts were cut at such an early period, who engineered a transport system at this scale on an island population with no known wheeled tradition? Some ruts intersect at acute angles that resemble rail switches rather than random erosion. In several areas, branching junctions suggest controlled directional movement, as if vehicles or sledges followed specific routes through a network. There are even locations where ruts cross over one another at different depths, implying that newer tracks were carved after older ones had already formed. This suggests prolonged use rather than a single construction period. The physical labor required would have been enormous. To cut even one pair of ruts deeply into limestone requires sustained mechanical abrasion under heavy load. To create hundreds of such tracks across the island would require centuries of continuous movement and maintenance. Yet Malta's prehistoric population was relatively small. What were they transporting in such volume and over such duration? Stone for temples is one candidate, but the number of ruts far exceeds what would be required to supply even all known temple construction. And many ruts appear in regions far from any major monument. Another hypothesis suggests agricultural transport hauling soil, produce, or water containers across rocky plateaus. But again, normal farming activity does not require deep rock-cut channels at this scale. One radical idea proposes that the ruts may not represent transportation at all, but some form of ritual marking, territorial division, or symbolic mapping carved permanently into the land. However, Their functional geometry and wear patterns strongly argue against purely symbolic intent. What everyone agrees on is this: the ruts were created deliberately, by sustained, repeated movement of heavy loads, and they form part of a system rather than random scratches. Standing at a major rut cluster today, the experience is disorienting. You see lines going in every direction, some rising, some sinking, some fading into grass. Orientation becomes difficult because there is no obvious center of activity, no main road, no central hub. The land itself becomes the infrastructure. Unlike roads built above ground, these tracks were carved into the skin of the island and could not be easily erased without geological time. Even after thousands of years of weathering, they remain sharply visible. This permanence hints at a society that invested heavily in shaping its terrain rather than building temporary surfaces on top of it. There is also the problem of wheel size. If wheeled vehicles were used, their wheels would have needed to be extremely narrow and strong to fit such grooves without shattering. No archaeological remains of such wheels have ever been found on Malta. If sledges were used instead, the repeated scraping would have to follow the exact same paired paths every time across multiple generations to produce such uniform spacing. That implies surveying, planning, and route maintenance. The Malta cart ruts do not fit cleanly into any known technological category. They behave like roads, but they do not look like roads. They suggest transport, but leave behind no vehicles. They seem prehistoric, but reflect infrastructure-scale thinking. Perhaps most importantly, they cross time rather than belong fully to one era. Some ruts were likely carved earlier. Others appear to have been added later. The system may represent a palimpsest of movement, layers of transport activity accumulating across centuries until the surface itself became engraved with motion. At some point, the system stopped being used. Whatever economic or ritual demand sustained, it faded. Soil accumulated. Vegetation grew. New technologies replaced old pathways, but the ruts remained. The underground megacity of Kaymakli, Turkey. Beneath the soft volcanic plains of central Turkey, hidden below modern villages and quiet farmland, lies a city that was never meant to be seen from the sky. There are no towers to mark its location, no walls rising above the earth, no ruins scattered across open ground. Its entire architecture exists below the surface, carved into stone, expanding sideways and downward in darkness. This is Kaymakli Underground City, one of the largest and most complex underground settlements ever created. From the outside, the landscape gives nothing away. Modest houses, narrow streets, and ordinary courtyards sit directly above a vast hidden world. Only when you descend through a narrow opening does the scale begin to reveal itself. The passage slopes downward, the ceiling lowering as the temperature cools. Light fades quickly. Within a few steps, the surface disappears entirely. Kaymakli is not a single-level shelter. It is a vertical city carved across at least 8 major levels, reaching more than 40 meters below the ground. Only a portion of those levels is open to visitors today. Even that accessible portion contains enough rooms, corridors, and chambers to overwhelm the senses. The city was carved into a soft volcanic rock known as tuff. This stone is firm enough to hold shape when exposed to air, yet soft enough to be worked with simple tools. Over many centuries, inhabitants carved living spaces directly into the bedrock, not in straight lines or simple rooms, but in a complex honeycomb of movement corridors, storage spaces, ventilation shafts, and sealed defensive chambers. Kaymakli is not alone. It forms part of a wider underground network beneath the region of Cappadocia, where dozens of subterranean cities are known to exist. Some are small, others, like Derinkuyu and Kaymakli, reach staggering scale. In several cases, these hidden cities are believed to have been linked by tunnel networks spanning kilometers. This raises the idea of an underground civilization layered beneath the surface, world not in myth, but as physical infrastructure. The origins of Kaymakli stretch deep into antiquity. The earliest levels are believed to date back to at least the Phrygian period around the 1st millennium BCE, though some evidence suggests initial carving may be even older. What makes Kaymakli remarkable is not simply its origin, but how long it continued to expand. Different historical periods added new layers, new chambers, new defensive features. Byzantine communities later repurposed much of the city as refuge during times of persecution and invasion. For over 2,000 years, the underground city was not a relic. It was an active survival system. Walking through Kamakli today, the layout feels neither random nor symmetrical. Corridors curve sharply, narrow suddenly, and then widen into chambers large enough to hold dozens of people. Most passages force visitors to stoop or crouch. This was not accidental. The architecture was designed to favor defenders who already knew the layout over invaders who did not. At key junctions, massive circular stone doors still rest in their original positions. These doors are not hung on hinges. They are carved as rolling stone discs that could be pushed into place from inside narrow side channels. Once closed, the heavy stone blocked the passage completely, leaving only a small central hole that could be used to pass air or thrust a spear toward an attacker. Each level of Kamakli had its own sealed defensive zones. If one level was breached, others could be isolated instantly. The city was compartmentalized, like a modern submarine. Life underground required more than walls and doors. It required air. Kamakli contains dozens of vertical ventilation shafts that extend from the deepest levels, all the support and set-in way to the surface. These shafts are not straight. They twist and branch, distributing fresh air throughout the city, while also acting as emergency water wells and sound conduits. Even today, airflow through these shafts is strong enough that candles flicker in deep chambers, far from any entrance. In addition to air, the city required food storage on a massive scale. Long rooms carved into side chambers served as granaries. Stone bins stored grains. Cooler, deeper chambers preserved produce. Wine and oil presses were carved directly into the rock, complete with channels and collection basins. This was not a temporary hideout. This was a place designed for long-term occupancy. At its peak, Kamakli is estimated to have supported up to 20,000 people at a time, including livestock. Stables are carved into the lower levels near ventilation shafts, where fresh air could reach animals. Feeding, watering, and waste management were all integrated into the urban design. Religious life also moved underground. Chapels were carved into open chambers. Stone altars still remain. Cross carvings appear on walls in the upper levels, showing Christian usage during late antiquity. These worship spaces were not hidden corners. They were central gathering areas, indicating that underground life was not merely about survival, but about preserving community identity. Daily life followed an inward rhythm. Light came from oil lamps and torches. Smoke escaped through ventilation shafts. The sound of movement echoed softly through stone corridors. Families lived in small, carved rooms with stone benches and sleeping platforms. Storage jars were tucked into wall niches. Every object had its place in a settlement, where space could not be wasted. One of the most remarkable features of Kamakli is its spatial organization. Unlike a surface city built outward across land, the underground city folded inward on itself. One chamber often serves multiple functions depending on time of day. Corridors double as transit routes and defensive barriers. Rooms stack above and below one another, connected through steep vertical shafts. This architecture requires advanced spatial planning. Builders had to visualize the three-dimensional layout in solid stone before carving. A wrong cut could collapse an entire chamber system or breach into neighboring levels unexpectedly. The question naturally arises: why build a city underground at all? The answer lies in the long history of conflict in this region. Cappadocia sat at the crossroads of empires: Hittite, Persian, Greek, Roman, Byzantine, Arab, and later Ottoman. Invasions, raids, and religious persecutions were recurring realities. Surface settlements were vulnerable. Underground ones were not. An advancing army could burn houses and seize fields, but an underground city left little to attack. Entrances could be hidden. Settlements could vanish beneath the landscape within hours. Entire populations could disappear from view, leaving invaders facing empty villages and silent hills. Kamakli was not built in response to one single invasion. It was built as a long-term survival adaptation to a world that never settled into permanent peace. The tunnel networks between underground cities add another layer of complexity. Some passages extend for kilometers beneath the surface, allowing populations to move between hidden centers without ever emerging above ground. These tunnels are narrow, often only wide enough for one person to move through at a time. They curve and dip unpredictably, making navigation difficult without intimate knowledge. The full extent of these networks is still not fully mapped. This interconnection suggests that Cappadocia's underground system was not a collection of independent shelters, but part of a regional defensive strategy distributed across the landscape. What makes Kaymakli unsettling is how complete it feels. This was not an improvised refuge. It was an urban system with streets, neighborhoods, food supply chains, ventilation infrastructure, religious centers, and layered defense, all without sunlight. And yet, despite its scale and longevity, Kaymakli eventually fell silent. As political conditions stabilized, surface life returned. Above-ground villages grew secure. Trade routes stabilized. The need for prolonged underground occupation diminished. Gradually, families stopped retreating below. Entrances were forgotten. Passages collapsed. Knowledge of the full layout faded. By the time modern researchers began systematic exploration in the 20th century, parts of Kaymakli had already been rediscovered and reused by locals as storage cellars. But the deeper layers remained sealed, untouched for centuries. Excavation revealed spaces where everyday objects were left behind: grinding stones, storage jars, lamp holders not arranged as museum displays, but abandoned mid-use, as if intended to be retrieved and never reclaimed. The psychological impact of walking through Kaymakli today is difficult to separate from the architecture itself. There are no wide horizons, no sky, no clear sense of direction. Orientation depends entirely on memory and signage. Without them, one can become disoriented within minutes. This was part of the defense. For outsiders, the underground world was designed to confuse. For insiders, it was home. The underground megacity of Kaymakli does not fit neatly into traditional categories of ancient cities. It was not built for trade, display, or empire. It was built for endurance, for survival in a region where surface certainty could vanish overnight. It represents a form of urbanism shaped not by expansion, but by retreat, not by domination of space, but by concealment within it. Even now, beneath ordinary streets and quiet homes, its deepest corridors remain in darkness, still connected by air shafts, still holding the shape of a vanished underground society. Kaymakli reminds us that some of the most ambitious cities in history were never meant to be seen. They were meant to endure unseen.